Sera, a Dungeon Revival LitRPG. By Mizar Kaf. Chapter 11 Control. Sera shook her head as she saw a cloud of flies manifest in front of her. The tiny, buzzing insects coalesced, gradually forming into Zoha's familiar form. The demoness appeared racked with convulsions, body shuddering violently as she coughed up purple blood. Zoha crawled toward Sera weakly. Her trembling fingers grasped weakly at the Elder Dryad's feet, the touch barely perceptible through the blood on her hands. Sera stepped back and shot the demoness a disdainful expression. "You should have known that this was going to happen. Please, forgive me, mistress." "That depends. Have you come to grasp the futility of opposing me?" Zoha nodded frantically, tears mixing with the blood on her face. Yes, I have." "If that's true, then be honest with me. Who were you meeting in order to tamper with the contract?" "I was meeting up with my brother, he's knowledgeable in magic." Sera's eyes narrowed, her suspicion deepening as she scrutinized Zoha. "Where is he?" Zoha's gaze flickered with fear, her eyes widening as she realized the gravity of the question. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. Seeing this, Sera clenched her hand into a fist. Instantly, Zoha screamed, the sound raw and piercing as her body convulsed violently. "Tell me where your brother is. You can't hide the truth forever." The demoness screams echoed through the room. Her body convulsed violently, gasping for breath between the screams, her eyes pleading for a mercy that Sera had no intention of granting. In the next few seconds, Zoha's screams grew louder, yet she still refused to answer. Her defiance shone through despite the agony etched across her face. Sera channeled the power of the contract to inflict more pain on Zoha. The demoness' screams became even more agonized, echoing off the walls. "You can't protect him forever. The pain will only get worse." But despite the increasing torment, Zoha's lips remained tightly sealed. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the blood that dripped from her chin, but she refused to utter a word about her brother's location. After a moment, Sera released her grip and eased the tension in her hands. The demoness' screams subsided into ragged breaths, though her body kept trembling from the ordeal. Zoha's brother is important enough to her that she isn't willing to disclose his location. Pressing her further would likely prove fruitless. I should utilize a different approach. Sera stepped forward and approached Zoha. She gently helped the demoness onto the bed, her touch almost tender despite the recent display of power. Zoha's breathing was shallow and uneven. She looked up at Sera, confused. "Why are you helping me?" Sera shook her head, a cold smile playing on her lips. "Because I want to, that is all. With all due respect, mistress, am I not presenting a risk towards you? I had just tried to break our contract and refused to say anything about my brother." While everything that Zoha said was true, Sera thought carefully about what she was going to say next. Demons are many things, but they all respect strength. I'll use this chance to make the gap in our power more apparent. To be quite frank, I find your attempt to break free adorable, Zoha. Adorable. Your attempts to break the contract are like a bird trying to fly out of its cage. It's endearing, really. The effort is commendable, even if ultimately futile. Zoha initially frowned as she processed Sera's words. Yet, she soon tilted her head slightly, the movement causing a few strands of her hair to fall across her face. "Mistress, are you not going to punish me?" Sera shook her head. "There is no point in punishing you for something which is in your nature. I understand your desire for freedom, but you must realize that this contract is not something you can break even if I gave you 100 years to do so." "I don't understand why you are letting me off so easily," Zoha said. Sera's expression remained calm, though her thoughts whirred internally. She knew that ruling through fear and punishment could only take her so far. Punishing Zoha might temporarily subdue her, but it wouldn't foster the loyalty or trust Sera desired. If I show leniency towards Zoha now, it may plant the seeds of a more genuine allegiance in the future. But if worse comes to worse, then I will simply remove her. You don't need to understand, but only to listen to my instructions." Zoha nodded slowly, but her eyes remained skeptical. "I understand, mistress. But I need to know, are you planning to punish me more severely later?" Sera sighed, weighing her words carefully. "To be perfectly candid, Zoha, as long as you heed my orders and refrain from obstructing my plans in the future, I am willing to overlook your actions for now." She paused, letting the words sink in. "However, consider this your final warning. If you defy me again, I will not be so lenient." Zoha's eyes widened slightly, but nodded in understanding. Understood, mistress. Thank you for your leniency. Good, if nothing else, we should return to the slums again in a few hours. The moment Sera and Zoha stepped foot in the slums, a wave of people surged forward, their desperate energy palpable. Faces edged with hunger and hope pushed towards them, creating a human tide that almost completely surrounded them. Zoha moved through the crowd with practiced ease, slipping through the gaps between bodies while Sera followed closely behind. The crowd pressed in tighter, hands reaching out to graze the fabric of her cloak as if hoping that mere contact might transfer some of her power to them. They finally settled in front of a rundown building with cracked windows and a door barely clung to its hinges. Sera took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. She steadied herself, fingers tingling with the familiar warmth of her magic as she prepared to heal while Zoha stood beside her. One by one, Sera healed the sick and injured. Her magic flowed effortlessly, closing wounds, mending bones, and easing pain. Each person she touched expressed their gratitude in their own way, some with curt nods, others with whispered thanks, and a few even pressed spare coins into her hands. The crowd fell silent and parted away as a group of men marched forward. Their leader, a tall man with a scar running down his left cheek, took center stage. His cold eyes scanned the crowd before settling on Sera with a piercing glare. "This woman is a fraud," he shouted. Sera, far from intimidated, found herself amused by the bold proclamation. A smirk played on her lips as she met the leader's gaze. "Do you have any evidence to support your claim?" The leader gestured to his men, who stepped aside to reveal a small, three-legged dog. The poor creature's eyes were wide with fear, and its fur was matted with dirt and dried blood. A real prophetess should have no problem restoring this animal to full health. Sera's eyes softened as she looked at the dog. "I agree, step away from the dog, and I will do what needs to be done." The men exchanged glances initially. However, at a nod from their leader, they reluctantly stepped back, giving Sera the space she needed. She knelt beside the dog before gently brushing its head. The dog's three-legged condition appeared to be some form of congenital deformity, something it had lived with since birth. Yet, the fresh wounds were undoubtedly inflicted by humans, likely the very men now watching her with narrowed eyes. Sera drew on her magic, feeling it flow through her like a river of warmth and light. She directed the energy towards the dog's injuries. The crowd held its breath as a soft glow enveloped the dog. Tiny sparks of light danced along its wounds, stitching together torn flesh and sealing away pain. Then, where there had been only 3 legs, a faint outline appeared. The crowd watched, transfixed, as the outline solidified, muscle and bone weaving together, then, fur sprouted, matching seamlessly with the rest of the dog's coat. Gasps of astonishment erupted from the onlookers as the dog's new leg was now fully formed, completely indistinguishable from the others. It stood tentatively at first, testing its newfound balance. But after it got used to its new leg, the dog jumped around in joyous circles. The dog's tail wagged furiously as it ran straight to Sera, leaping up to her with great eagerness as it licked her face over and over again. Sera's face softened, eyes crinkling at the corners as she gently stroked its head. The men who had interrupted Sera earlier became flustered as the crowd erupted into cheers. However, their leader remained stoic. He coughed into his hand and barked out, "Everyone, shut up." The crowd's cheers faltered into a tense silence. The leader gestured to his men, who disappeared briefly before returning, flanking a familiar figure draped in rich purple robes. "This," the leader announced, "is the prophet of Zephyro." The prophet stepped forward, his presence exuding an aura of arrogance. "I am not impressed, such parlor tricks may fool the simple-minded, but they hold no sway over me." Sera chuckled softly, with both amusement and disdain. Her eyes glittered with a cold, calculating light as she regarded the scene before her. She let the dog go, its fur brushing against her fingers as it scampered away. Then, she leaned towards Zoha, lips barely moving as she whispered, "Remove them immediately." Zoha nodded imperceptibly and slipped away into the crowd. Meanwhile, Sera turned her attention back to the false prophet. "I've already proven my abilities, what say you?" The false prophet sneered and opened his mouth to retort, but his words were cut short as a tiny, dark fly landed on his cheek. He swatted at it absently, unaware of how several other dark flies landed on the necks of the men who had interrupted Sera before. Suddenly, the men dropped to the ground, one by one. Their confident postures crumbled as they clutched at their throats. The crowd gasped as they watched the men collapse, writhing on the dirty ground. The dark flies then took off into the air, disappearing as swiftly as they had appeared. The prophet of Zephyros' face turned ashen, his eyes widening in fear as he watched his followers fall. He stumbled back, nearly tripping over his own robes. What is this? Sera stepped forward and stopped just in front of him. This is what happens when one goes against a prophetess of the goddess Sera. As Sera's words echoed, the prophet gasped and clutched at his throat. His legs buckled, and he fell to his knees before collapsing completely. The crowd watched in stunned horror as the prophet's life ebbed away, his body convulsing briefly before going still. Sera saw her chance and took it. Behold the fate of false prophets. They have been smitten by the divine wrath of goddess Sera. The moment she finished speaking, the crowd's fear quickly transformed into fervent belief. Their murmurs grew into shouts of devotion as they looked at her with newfound reverence. Just a little bit more. She raised her hands in an effort to further command their attention. Who among you are true believers in goddess Sera? Who wishes to receive more of her blessings? Hands shot up, voices crying out in eager response. The energy of the crowd was electric. Sera let the fervor build and allowed the energy to peak, before raising her hand for silence. And who among you is ready to follow me on a journey to the promised land? I am ready, shouted a young man at the front. Take me with you, Sera, cried a woman, clutching a tattered shawl to her chest. More people from the crowd surged forward. Each person reached out, hands extended towards Sera with their fingers trembling. Sera smiled, feeling the fervent energy of the crowd washing over her. Perhaps I may have overdone things just a little bit. Zoha soon re-emerged from the crowd. She slipped to Sera's side, her presence barely noticed by the throng of adoring followers. Leaning in close, she whispered, "What is our next step, mistress?" Sera's eyes scanned the fervent crowd. "We need to separate the most fervent believers from the rest. Those who are truly devoted will follow us without hesitation. How can I help? Just watch over the humans for now and make sure we receive no more interruptions." Duly noted. Sera raised her hands to call for silence. The crowd quickly obeyed, eyes fixed on her. "Followers of goddess Sera, we will now identify those among you who are the most devoted. Please form a line and come forward one by one." The crowd shuffled into a semblance of order. Their fervor undiminished as they awaited Sera's next command. Sera stood at the head of the line. With a calculated smile, she decided to test their devotion with a series of increasingly ridiculous tasks. This will weed out those who still have doubts. To prove your devotion, I ask each of you to perform a task. Only those who complete them without question will be chosen. She started by assigning simple tasks, watching closely as the followers knelt to recite prayers to Sera or shared personal stories of faith. But as the day wore on, the tasks grew more absurd. Sera's eyes sparkled with amusement as she asked them to balance objects on their heads, hop on one foot, and even sing certain songs backward. She observed each attempt, noting the lengths they were willing to go to prove themselves worthy. To her surprise, only a few people left during the odd tasks she set out. Most of the humans stayed throughout the entirety of her nonsensical trials. At one point, a man wobbled precariously with a stack of wooden planks teetering on his head while a woman sang a hymn in reverse in a shaky voice. Zoha, who was standing off to the side, watched the spectacle with growing confusion. It was visibly evident that the absurdity of the tasks baffled the demoness. During a brief pause, she approached Sera discreetly. "Pardon my curiosity, mistress, but what is the point of these tasks?" "The point is to find those who will do everything I ask without question. The smart ones have all left long ago, leaving me with the most desperate among them." "I see, which means the humans who are left probably won't bat an eye if you ask them to follow you into the dungeon." "Precisely." The trials continued for a few more hours. Sera watched as the most fervent believers performed without hesitation, their devotion shining through their actions. Slowly but surely, the group was whittled down to around 60 of the most devout. Finally, Sera addressed the selected group, her voice gentle but commanding. "You, the chosen ones, have proven your devotion to goddess Sera. Your faith is unwavering, and your hearts are pure. I ask you now to wait for me at a specified location. Tomorrow, I will return here, and we will embark on a sacred journey together." As the chosen followers dispersed to await the appointed time, Sera turned to Zoha. They walked away from the crowd, the soft murmur of voices fading behind them. "Do you know a way to transport all of these humans?" "Because I'd rather not have to walk them to the dungeon," Sera asked. Zoha thought for a moment before speaking. There is one person who might be able to help us with transporting these humans, mistress. Sera raised an eyebrow, intrigued but skeptical. Oh? And who might that be? Countess Ivirus, Zoha said. A countess? Why would someone of her status assist us? Countess Ivirus is a special case, mistress. She has experienced certain circumstances that align with our goals. With your abilities, I am confident she will be more than willing to come through for us. Chapter 12 Faith's Reward. Sera followed Zoha to the gates of an old, worn-down mansion. Ivy climbed the walls, creeping over cracked stones and broken windows. All while the garden was overgrown with weeds and wild flowers, partially covering the path leading to the main entrance. Sera's eyes narrowed as she took in the sight. Does anyone actually live here? Zoha nodded. Countess Ivirus and her staff still actively live here. Is there a reason why a noble's estate looks so ruined? The countess has never been the same since her husband passed away and her son was struck by a grueling illness at the same time. She forbade her staff from even just tending to the gardens out of grief. Interesting, presumably she will give a great reward to anyone who could cure her son. It's very likely, mistress. I've spoken with the countess when she was in better condition. She used to be very generous and financed several quests in the Adventurers Guild by herself. Zoha reached for a magical doorbell, an ornate brass bell adorned with intricate runes. As she rang it, the bell glowed briefly as it emitted soft chime that resonated through the air. Moments later, a butler with a graying beard approached the gates. He bowed his head slightly in recognition as he neared them. Lady Zoha, it has been quite some time. How may I assist you this evening? Zoha stepped forward, her demeanor polite yet authoritative. Gunter, I'd like you to meet Sera. She is a healer of extraordinary capability. Gunter turned his gaze to Sera and raised an eyebrow. A healer, you say? Yes, and I have seen her abilities firsthand. She has performed many feats of healing in the slums of Marwood, even going so far as to restore limbs. I don't mean to put too much doubt on your words, Lady Zoha. But the Countess has been disappointed by far too many charlatans already. That is completely understandable, and I deeply sympathize with Countess Ivirus. However, I swear on my own life that Sera's abilities are true. Sera met the butler's gaze with unwavering confidence. There is no ailment too great nor affliction too deep that cannot be cured. I'm here only to help, not to seek any form of payment or reward. Gunther's eyes widened slightly, clearly taken aback by the conviction in her words. The skepticism in his gaze softened as it was instead replaced by a gradually growing hope. I certainly hope you're right, Gunter murmured. Afterwards, he grabbed a key from his pocket and unlocked the gates. Gunter then guided them to the main entrance where they stopped in front of a pair of heavy wooden doors. He knocked gently and waited until the doors were opened by another servant who stepped aside to allow them entry. This way, Gunter said, leading Sera and Zoha through a hallway. The two of them followed the butler through the corridors of the mansion until they reached a heavy wooden door. Gunter opened it slowly to reveal a spacious room filled with ornate furniture, and a large fireplace that dominated one wall, though its hearth was cold and empty. Countess Ivirus was seated in a plush chair near the fireplace, her frail form wrapped in a thick velvet robe. The warmth of the fire casted a soft glow on her pale and sickly face. When Sera and Zoha entered the room, they saw the Countess quickly cough into a napkin, which she discreetly handed off to a maid standing nearby. She dismissed the maid and Gunter with a wave of her hand. Leave us, she commanded. Once they were alone, the Countess turned her full attention to the demoness. Who is this person you've brought to me, Zoha? Zoha offered a reassuring smile. This is Sera, an old friend of mine and a very capable healer. Countess Ivirus's gaze flicked to Sera with a weary expression. She studied Sera intently, as if trying to discern the truth behind the demoness' words. A capable healer, you say? What proof do you have of her abilities? Sera took a step forward and inclined her head respectfully. Countess Ivirus, I understand your caution. Healing is a delicate and personal matter. I assure you, I am well versed in my craft and have aided many in their time of need. Words are easy. Deeds are what matter. Countess Ivirus said bluntly. Countess, please, you know me. I would not bring anyone to you unless I trusted them completely. Sera has the skills and the heart to help you, Zoha said. A silence stretched between them all. The Countess's stern gaze remained fixed on Zoha, searching for any sign of deceit. Yet, gradually, the Countess's expression softened, if only by a fraction. Very well. Sit down, Both of you. Zoha and Sera moved to the ornately carved chairs opposite the Countess. The rich fabric of the seats felt cool and smooth under their hands. Ivirus's fingers trembled slightly as she clasped them in her lap, the delicate lace of her sleeves brushing against her wrists. Sera decided to ease into the conversation first. Thank you for giving us a chance, Countess Ivirus. I understand this must be a difficult time for you. The Countess's eyes moved between Sera and Zoha, settling finally on Sera. Enough talk, you speak of healing. Prove your capability to me. I am prepared to do so right now, Countess. You're not going to ask for money or materials first. Most healers I've seen demand compensation or specific items before even considering an attempt. Sera shook her head gently. I do not require those things, Countess. My abilities do not hinge on material wealth or rare ingredients. I can heal you on the spot. And why should I believe you? Many have come claiming miraculous powers, only to disappoint. I understand your hesitation. All I ask is for you to allow me this opportunity to prove myself. If you feel no improvement, you owe me nothing. The Countess regarded Sera for a long moment. Finally, she nodded slowly. Very well. Proceed. Sera rose and knelt beside Ivirus's chair as her hands glowed with a soft, warm light. Please close your eyes and try to relax. The Countess hesitated for a moment before closing her eyes. Sera's hands hovered over the Countess's frail form, the glow intensifying as she focused her energy. As the light touched Ivirus, it spread quickly through her body. Her once frail hands became steady, while the pallor of her skin gave way to a healthy flush. Soon, Sera withdrew her hands, the glow fading as she completed the healing. She looked up at Ivirus, who had just opened her eyes and blinked a few times. The Countess's expression was one of astonishment. She flexed her fingers, the trembling completely gone. And her once fatigued eyes now shone with renewed vitality and clarity. How do you feel? Sera asked. Countess Ivirus took a moment to move a hand to her chest where the pain had been most intense. I feel wonderful. The pain is all gone. I'm so glad to see you better, Countess Ivirus. Zoha said. The Countess turned to Zoha with a warm smile. Thank you for bringing your friend to me. She then looked at Sera, eyes brimming with gratitude. And thank you, for healing me. I haven't felt this way in years. Sera nodded, a gentle smile on her lips. I'm happy to help, Countess. Countess Ivirus's eyes shone with gratitude, but concern quickly crossed her face. She took a deep breath before speaking. I must ask something more of you, Sera. My son, Simon, has been gravely ill for months. Can you help him as well? I can certainly try. Please, take me to him. The Countess motioned for them to follow, and they moved through the grand hallways of the mansion. They soon arrived at a heavy oak door carved with elaborate patterns, the swirls and flourishes inlaid with gleaming brass accents. Ivirus's hand rested momentarily on the cool brass handle. She took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling, before she turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room beyond was relatively dark, heavy curtains drawn to keep out the harsh light of the afternoon sun. The air was thick with the scent of medicinal herbs and faint traces of lavender, intended to soothe and heal. Simon was resting on an ornately carved bed. The boy's skin was pallid, almost translucent, contrasting starkly with the dark sheets that enveloped him. He looked frail, his once vibrant form now reduced to a shadow of its former self. His eyes were dull and lifeless, staring blankly at the ceiling. Countess Ivirus moved to his side, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead with tenderness. My son has been like this for months. Sera approached the bed slowly and assessed Simon's condition. She noted the dark circles under his eyes, the way his chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, and the slight tremor in his frail hands. His symptoms suggested a debilitating illness, possibly something that had slowly drained his life force over time. It was bad enough that part of Sera felt the slightest hint of pity for the human boy. She reached out and placed her hands gently on Simon's forehead. As she closed her eyes and focused, her hands glowed with a familiar light. The glow spread slowly, enveloping Simon's head and then moving down to cover his entire body. Color slowly returned to the boy's cheeks. Sera focused intently as her magic weaved through his veins. Soon, Simon's eyes fluttered open, their brightness restored. He looked around, confused at first, then met his mother's gaze. Mother! Countess Ivirus rushed to his side with tears of joy streaming down her face. Oh, Simon! You're awake. How do you feel, my dear? Simon sat up slowly, testing his strength. I feel, well. Countess Ivirus turned to Sera and Zoha. I cannot express how thankful I am. You have given me back my son. She took Zoha's hand, squeezing it gently. Thank you for bringing Sera to us. Zoha nodded, a soft smile on her lips. I'm glad I could help, Countess. Sera inclined her head. It was my honor to assist, Countess Ivirus. But Ivirus shook her head. No, Sera. Your kindness and skill cannot go unrewarded. You must tell me if there is anything you desire. Sera almost broke her facade with a smile. But she forced herself to maintain her composure. Can't let the mask fall off now. With a modest demeanor, she replied, there is one thing, Countess. I need help transporting several dozen people out of Marwood. The Countess's eyebrows arched in curiosity. Pardon? Why do you need to transport so many people? Sera took a deep breath, her mind racing as she formulated her response. Countess, while I am a capable healer, there are limits to what I can achieve on my own. The people I wish to transport are gravely ill, and there are only so many I can tend to at a time. Therefore, I seek to bring them to a sacred location where my healing powers can be greatly enhanced. Countess Ivirus studied Sera intently, her eyes sharp and discerning. For a moment, Sera feared that her lie would be seen through. But to her surprise, the Countess nodded thoughtfully. Ah, I see, Ivirus said, her tone contemplative. A sacred location, you say? That is indeed a wise course of action. Healing such numbers would be a daunting task for any one person. I can arrange for wagons and carts to aid you in this endeavor. Will that suffice? Sera inwardly sighed with relief, maintaining her composed exterior. That would be more than sufficient, Countess. Your generosity is greatly appreciated. With your assistance, these people will have a chance to recover in a place of sanctity and peace. The Countess smiled, a hint of satisfaction in her expression. Consider it done, then. I will have my men prepare the necessary transportation immediately. When will you need the wagons? By dawn tomorrow would be ideal, Countess. The sooner we can begin the journey, the better for those in need. Very well. I will have my servants begin preparations immediately. You shall have everything you need at the aforementioned time. Sera bowed deeply. Your kindness knows no bounds, Countess Ivirus. We are deeply grateful. Zoha added, indeed, Countess. Your support means more to us than you can imagine. We will always remember your generosity. The Countess waved a hand dismissively, although her eyes sparkled with approval. Think nothing of it. And before both of you leave, feel free to relax in the guest room for as long as you need if you wish. Sera perked up at the suggestion. Countess, would you mind terribly if we requested some desserts? It's been quite a day. Countess Ivirus chuckled warmly, clearly amused by Sera's request. Not a problem at all, my dear. You have only to ask Gunter and he will see to it that you receive whatever you desire. Gunter escorted Sera and Zoha into a modestly furnished room with a table at its center. The space was cozy, with warm wooden walls and soft lighting casting a gentle glow. An unfinished chessboard stood on a small round table, the pieces scattered as if abandoned mid-game. But more importantly, there was another table stacked with various desserts. Delicate pastries with flaky, golden crusts were arranged in neat rows beside rich, dark chocolate truffles dusted with cocoa powder. Crystal bowls filled with sugared nuts and candied fruits added the finishing touch. Gunter hesitated by the table, his hand hovering over the chessboard. Shall I clear this up for you? Sera waved a hand gently. It's fine, thank you. The butler bowed slightly before retreating, closing the door quietly behind him. As soon as he left, Sera's eyes were drawn to the table filled with desserts. She immediately approached it, her fingers lightly brushing over the delicate pastries before selecting a fruit tart. She picked it up carefully, admiring the glistening berries and the buttery crust for a moment before taking a small bite, savoring the burst of flavors. I really need to bring someone who can make desserts into the dungeon sometime in the future. Yet, as she continued sampling the various desserts, Sera eventually saw that Zoha had seated herself at the table with the chessboard. The demoness was carefully rearranging the pieces to their original positions. And once the pieces were back in their starting places, Zoha began to move them again, her eyes focused intently on the board. Curiosity piqued, Sera finished chewing the dessert she was eating and approached Zoha. What are you doing? Zoha looked up, a faint smile playing on her lips. I used to play chess quite often, mistress, and I enjoy practicing with myself whenever I have the chance. It helps me keep my mind sharp. Is that so? Would you be willing to teach me how to play? Zoha paused for a moment, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully before a smug grin spread across her face. I'd be more than happy to teach you, mistress. Sera took a seat opposite Zoha. Very well, explain the basics to me. Zoha nodded, her fingers gently tapping the board. Each piece has its own unique movements, she said, placing the pawns in their respective positions. The pawns move forward but capture diagonally. The demoness continued, setting the knights, bishops, rooks, and finally the king and queen in their starting squares and then demonstrating how they could move one by one. Ultimately, the objective is to checkmate the opponent's king. I think I have a decent grasp of the rules now. Sera said. Zoha set the pieces in their starting positions. Are you ready to start playing, mistress? Sera straightened in her chair, fingers lightly drumming on the table. I am. As the game began, it quickly became apparent that Sera's understanding of the rules was no match for Zoha's experience. The demoness's hands moved with effortless confidence, each piece gliding across the board with purpose. In contrast, Sera's movements were hesitant and uncertain. She paused frequently and had to think for quite some time before each move. It didn't take long for Zoha to use her rook and bishop to coordinate a seamless trap. Sera's eyes widened as she realized the trap was closing around her king. She tried to move to counter, but it was too late. Zoha's lips curved into a satisfied smile as she leaned back in her chair. Checkmate, I win. Sera frowned. She studied the board, the realization of her defeat sinking in. Let's play again. Of course, mistress. Zoha said, resetting the board. This time, Sera's focus was much sharper. She managed to hold her own against Zoha, even putting her in a few tricky positions that required careful navigation. However, a single blunder shifted the balance as Sera left one of her knights completely unguarded. Zoha quickly capitalized on the mistake, her pieces moving swiftly to corner Sera's king once more. Checkmate. The demoness looked up, genuinely impressed by Sera's improvement. You did much better that time, mistress. You're improving quickly. By this point, Sera's eyes were intense and almost trance-like. We're not finished yet. One more game. Zoha hesitated as she sensed a shift in Sera's demeanor. The determination in the Elder Dryad's eyes had taken on an almost obsessive quality. Still, the demoness reset the board despite her growing unease. This time, Sera's hands darted over the board with increasing speed as the game progressed, each piece snapping into place with a decisive click. Zoha watched her carefully, noting the deepening trance-like state that consumed Sera more and more with every turn. The demoness struggled to keep up with Sera's relentless pace. Her own moves were deliberate and cautious, but she could feel the game slipping away from her. Finally, with a swift and decisive move, Sera declared, checkmate. Zoha stared at the board, momentarily stunned by the rapid succession of moves that had led to her defeat. She looked up at Sera, who was still in the grip of her trance-like state. Maybe we should stop playing for now, mistress. You seem different. Sera's eyes flashed with an almost manic intensity. Just one more game. Zoha was much more wary this time, but she reluctantly reset the board once more, fingers trembling slightly as she placed the pieces in their starting positions. The final game began, and Sera's trance-like state peaked. The Elder Dryad's focus was absolute. It was as if she were possessed by some ancient force, guided by a power beyond herself. In half the time as the previous game, Sera declared checkmate once more. Zoha stared at the board blankly for a few seconds before looking up at Sera. Mistress, are you all right? Sera blinked a few times, her eyes gradually losing their intense focus. She slowly appeared to return to herself as the trance faded. She clutched her head slightly, a pained look crossing her face. I'm fine, we should go. Chapter 13 Judgment. The Grand Tribunal Hall. There was only one thought that inhabited Chancellor Alistair's mind, contempt. He looked impassively towards 3 prisoners being escorted by armed guards to the center of the hall. The first prisoner was the captain of the Royal Guard. His uniform had been stripped of all of its embellishments and emblems, a gesture that was both symbolic and intentionally humiliating. Filthy bastard, serves you right. Next was the head of the Royal Mages. Her regal bearing had not entirely been extinguished by the chains that bound her. She was a tall and slender elf, and her robes, though torn and dirted, still shimmered faintly with residual magic. What a shame, she wouldn't have been here if it weren't for the mistakes of others. But the person Chancellor Alastair had the most disdain for was none other than a fellow councillor. He was a bloated man with a balding head. He still wore luxurious clothes, though their glamour had been greatly diminished by the bruises and scars marring his skin. The worst among them without a shadow of a doubt. All three prisoners were brought to the center of the hall and forced onto their knees, each one arranged in order of their status. The captain knelt first, followed by their mage. Last was the councillor, his knees hitting the ground with a wind-ce. Silence settled over the hall, yet it was only fleeting. Soon, whispers erupted among the gathered nobles and dignitaries. Chancellor Alastair let the chatter continue for a time, observing how the prisoners' shame played against the backdrop of noble intrigue. But eventually, he raised a hand, a simple yet authoritative gesture that commanded immediate silence. Once everyone was quiet, the Chancellor spoke. Esteemed members of the tribunal and honored guests, we are gathered here not for a trial, but for a judgment. The three individuals before us have already been deemed guilty of heinous crimes not only against the kingdom of Lizaria but also against the honor of the Lizarian crown. He paused for a moment before continuing. By the grace of His Majesty, King Regulus IV, I shall now read the crimes committed by each of the prisoners before you. Alastair turned his gaze to the captain of the Royal Guard. You stand guilty of misusing funds allocated to the Royal Guard and selling equipment belonging to the Guard to third parties. Such charges, grievous as they are, would not ordinarily be sufficient by themselves to bring you to the Grand Tribunal Hall. However, your true crime lies in your gross incompetence and greed. You supplied insufficient and under-equipped soldiers to accompany Prince Leo's expedition to siphon more funds for your personal gain, which played a significant part in the disappearance of Prince Leo alongside his entire expeditionary force. The Chancellor gave another long pause before continuing. For these actions, you are sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. The Royal Guard captain's shoulders sagged further. He offered no words of defense or protest as the guards stepped forward to escort him out. The chamber remained silent as the captain was led away. The nobles and dignitaries watched with morbid curiosity, their eyes following his every step. Some appeared to show pity, but most held nothing but contempt. Chancellor Alastair waited until the doors closed with a resounding thud, sealing the captain's fate. Only then did he turn his attention back to the assembly. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as Chancellor Alastair's gaze shifted to the head of the royal mages. You, on the other hand, are guilty not of malicious intent, but of gross incompetence, due to failing to provide adequate mages to support Prince Leo's expedition. Yet, given the ongoing war, Alastair continued, the severity of the charges against the royal mages has been mitigated. It is understood that resources are stretched thin, and errors in judgment, while unacceptable, are not tantamount to treason. A slight movement from the mage caught his attention. Her shoulders saged slightly as the slightest hint of tears beaded from her eyes. Chancellor Alastair almost broke his calm demeanor as pity welled within him. Yet, he knew that he had a job to do and pushed on. Thus, the punishment decreed for the head of the royal mages is public flagellation. The crowd's murmur grew, but was quickly quelled by a stern look from the Chancellor. He then dismissed the head of the royal mages with a nod, signaling the guards to escort her out. She rose slowly, eyes remaining downcast as the guards led her away. Alastair waited for the head mage to be fully escorted out before moving on to the last prisoner. Counselor, you stand accused of multiple grievous crimes. You are not only guilty of siphoning funds meant for the kingdom's defense into your own pockets for years, but you also accepted compensation from the Adventurers Guild in exchange for lobbying this very council to approve hiring an overpriced adventurer who was unable to protect Prince Leo. The counselor's eyes widened in panic. No, please, I wasn't paid that much by the Adventurers Guild. It was a misunderstanding. Chancellor Alastair raised a hand to signal to the guards below. One of the guards stepped forward and delivered a swift punch to the counselor's face. The counselor staggered, blood trickling from his nose, his cries reduced to pained whimpers. Alastair turned his attention back to the assembly. The role of the Royal Council is to serve the kingdom's best interests in accordance with King Regulus IV's will. This councillor has betrayed that trust, placing his own greed above the welfare of the kingdom. He paused, allowing his words to sink in, the gravity of the situation hanging heavy in the air. For his crimes, I hereby sentence him to the blood pits. There, he will face a fate befitting a traitor to the crown. The councillor, though battered and bruised, cried out. No. Please, have mercy. Alistair, we've been friends for years. You know me, I can make amends. The guards moved in as they dragged the councillor away. He struggled weakly, his pleas growing more frantic as he was pulled towards the exit. Alistair, please. Think of our friendship. I can. But his words were cut off as the heavy doors closed behind him, sealing his fate. Chancellor Alistair took a deep breath as the traitor was finally removed for good. The entire hall was silent now, but his work was not yet finished. There is still one more matter to be discussed, Alistair announced. An aide approached, handing him a neatly folded paper. Alistair unfolded it carefully and cleared his throat before addressing the assembly. As you are all well aware, LitRPG has been embroiled in a protracted conflict with our neighbors. The war, though necessary, has stretched our resources thin, including our manpower and provisions. Moreover, the presumed death of Prince Leo cannot be left unanswered. It is a grievous wound to our realm, one that demands retribution and resolution. Therefore, with the Council's permission, I propose to authorize the use of the Inquisition to support this matter. Countless murmurs and whispers ran through the crowd, but Alistair's presence kept it subdued. He looked over the faces before him, gauging their reactions, before inviting further discourse. Are there any questions from the assembly before we proceed to the vote? A hand rose from among the gathered nobles, and Alistair nodded to the questioner, an older man with a distinguished bearing. Why was the Inquisition not involved in Prince Leo's expedition from the outset? Alistair inclined his head in acknowledgement. Since the inception of the war, the resources and personnel of the Inquisition have been redirected to foreign espionage and disruption operations far away. It was deemed at the time that the prince's expedition, while important, did not necessitate the involvement of the Inquisition. Obviously, the situation has changed now, which is why I have brought up utilizing our kingdom's greatest asset again. The noble nodded thoughtfully, accepting the explanation. Alistair's eyes swept the room once more. If there are no further questions, we shall proceed to the vote. The motion is thus, to authorize the deployment of the Inquisition to investigate and address the circumstances surrounding Prince Leo's expedition and presumed death. All in favor, raise your hands. The decision was completely unanimous as every single person in the hall raised their hand. It was an expected outcome, given the direness of the citation. Alistair allowed himself a small nod of satisfaction. The motion is passed. May justice prevail and may Prince Leo's legacy be honored through our actions. With this, I declare this session adjourned. While the nobles slowly filed out of the tribunal hall, Chancellor Alistair remained at his post. He called for an aide, a young man with an attentive demeanour who approached quickly. Alistair leaned to the young man's ear. Send an urgent request to the Inquisition. Inform them that I will be arriving personally soon. Chancellor Alistair stepped down from his carriage. As his boots touched the cobblestone path, he was immediately surrounded by dozens of acolytes in black robes. Their hoods cast deep shadows over their faces. One of the acolytes, distinguished by a silver thread woven into the hem of his robe, stepped forward and bowed deeply. Chancellor Alistair, we have been notified of your urgent request. Alistair nodded. Is she ready? The acolyte hesitated for a moment, then replied, It would be best for you to see for yourself, Chancellor. Please, follow me. The headquarters of the Inquisition was a formidable structure made of dark stone that rose sharply against the night sky. Tall, narrow windows were set deep into the walls, while heavy iron doors, adorned with intricate carvings of protective runes and grim visages, stood at the entrance. As they approached, the doors swung open with a deep, resonant groan. The air inside was cool and heavy with the scent of aged parchment and burning incense. Long corridors stretched out before them, lined with blue fire torches. Chancellor Alistair followed the acolyte deeper into the building in complete silence. The further they went, the more intricate the architecture became. Heavy wooden doors with complex iron locks gave way to steel doors secured by arcane symbols and magical wards. Each entrance required the acolyte to perform a precise series of gestures or utter a specific incantation in order to be opened. Descending deeper, they came to a spiral staircase carved from black stone that didn't appear to have an end. After what felt like an eternity of descent, they reached a final corridor that ended at a massive set of metal gates constructed of dark iron and reinforced with bands of enchanted silver. The acolyte was joined by several others who stood nearby, each carrying a key. Together, they approached the gates, and in a well-practiced sequence, inserted their keys into corresponding locks. The mechanisms inside the gates rumbled and clanked as the gates slowly swung open. Chancellor Alistair stepped into a vast, dark room. The chamber was cavernous, with its ceiling lost in shadow, creating an almost oppressive sense of scale. At the center of the room stood a massive sarcophagus, its formidable presence dominating the space. The sarcophagus was constructed of jet black stone, polished to a mirror-like finish that reflected the light from the torches lining the walls. The surface seemed to drink in the light, creating an eerie, almost liquid darkness. The lid of the sarcophagus was adorned with a meticulously carved relief of a figure in repose, arms crossed over its chest. However, what was most striking were the countless chains and locks that bound the sarcophagus. Every link and lock was inscribed with intricate runes designed to compress the magical power within to something more manageable. The acolyte moved towards Chancellor Alistair. "Chancellor, this Inquisitor is still unstable. Are you certain about awakening her?" Chancellor Alistair sighed deeply. "She is our only choice. While I dislike awakening her, I believe it is the best option for now. But Chancellor, the last time Haziel was awakened, over 10,000 people. I am well aware of the consequences, acolyte. Now, fetch me the Book of Rites." The acolyte bowed his head, retreating to a nearby pedestal where an ancient tome bound in cracked leather rested. He lifted it with care as he carried it back to Alistair. Chancellor Alistair took the book from the acolyte's trembling hands. "Which pages should I refer to?" The acolyte swallowed hard, flipping through the brittle pages with practiced fingers. "Page 72, Chancellor." Alistair nodded. "Good. Now, gather the other acolytes and step back." The acolyte nodded, hastily moving to summon his fellows. They retreated to the edges of the chamber, leaving Alistair alone with the sarcophagus. Chancellor Alistair walked around the massive stone coffin as he opened the Book of Rites to the indicated page and started to read aloud. "Raven, apple, tempest, stone." The chains wrapped around the sarcophagus began to shudder. One by one, the locks clicked open, their heavy metal forms falling to the floor with a resounding clang. The runes inscribed on the chains glowed fiercely before they shattered, pieces scattering across the floor. Alistair continued to chant, his voice growing stronger. "Ocean, ember, thorn, sky." Each phrase broke another chain, another lock. The heavy metal restraints shuddered and fell away, clattering to the ground. Ash, flame, night, dawn. More locks snapped open. Star, shadow, wind, earth. Blood, bone, light, fire. The remaining chains trembled violently before shattering, fragments scattering across the floor like shards of glass. Life, death, time, eternity, and with that, the last of the locks disintegrated. The sarcophagus lid burst open with a deafening crack, releasing a surge of magic so powerful that Alistair was thrown to the ground. The force of the blast sent him sprawling, his robes billowing around him as he struggled to regain his footing. He struggled to his feet while the Book of Rites laid on the floor beside him, its pages fluttering wildly. But gradually, the magical surge subsided, allowing Alistair to take a steady breath. He looked up, his eyes widening as he saw the figure within the sarcophagus. The room seemed to hold its breath as the runes on Haziel's skin flared with a brilliant light, casting an ethereal glow that illuminated the cavernous chamber. The light lingered for a moment, then dimmed and faded away, leaving the room in an almost oppressive silence. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing irises of a vivid, piercing red. Alistair cautiously pushed himself up from the floor, the force of the magical surge still resonating in his bones. His breath caught in his throat as he met Haziel's gaze. Her eyes locked onto his, a mixture of fierce intensity and calm composure. The Inquisitor's movements were graceful yet deliberate as she sat up. The chainmail beneath her uniform clinked softly with each motion while the dark blue fabric of her uniform clung to her form. Slowly, she rose from the sarcophagus, standing tall and poised. "Chancellor Alistair, it is an honor to serve once more." Chapter 14 Into the Unknown. Sera and Zoha slowly stepped off the carriage. Sera's foot landed first, sinking slightly into the gravel while Zoha followed. Horse-pulled wagons trailed behind them, grinding against the gravel path. The horses snorted softly, their breath forming small clouds in the crisp morning air. Zoha started to guide the people to stand in orderly groups. "Form lines here, please. Keep close and stay calm." The humans obeyed her directions and shuffled into place. They all looked quite exhausted, but none questioned what they were told. Sera watched intently as she silently counted each person. 60 tributes in total, excluding the drivers of the wagons and the carriage. Satisfied with her count, Sera turned to the coachman, who was adjusting the reins of his horses. Thank you for your service. You are free to return now. The coachman looked momentarily confused. He glanced at the assembled group and then back at Sera. Are you sure? Yes, thank you kindly for your work. The coachman responded with a curt grunt. He adjusted his seat before snapping the reins against the horses' backs. The powerful animals responded immediately, hooves striking the ground all at once. The other wagons soon followed, their drivers exchanging brief, wordless farewells with nods and quick waves. Dust settled in their wake, and the group left behind stood in the settling quiet. Sera was about to turn to the people, but her attention was caught by Zoha's unusual behavior. The demoness twitched her fingers nervously and her eyes darted around the surroundings constantly. She walked in front of Zoha and coughed loudly to catch the demoness' attention. Is something the matter? Zoha's eyes snapped to Sera's, wide and filled with unease. I feel like something dangerous has just appeared in the world, but I'm not sure what it is. Sera tilted her head. Are you really capable of sensing magic from farther away than I can? Zoha shook her head. I doubt it, mistress. But something is bothering me regardless. Sera glanced at the gathered humans, who were all chattering to each other. She patted Zoha on the shoulder in an effort to reassure the demoness. Save it for later. We have work to do. Zoha nodded, forcing a small smile. You're right. It's probably nothing. Sera turned to the gathered people and raised her voice to address the crowd. Are you ready to enter the divine realm promised by goddess Sera? Immediately, cheers and shouts of affirmation filled the air. Sera's lips curled into a knowing smile at what she saw. If only things could always be this easy. Soon, with Zoha's steadying presence at her side, Sera led the group toward the entrance of her dungeon. She moved with purpose, her steps confident on the worn path. Zoha's hand rested lightly on Sera's arm, a silent gesture of support and unity. As they neared the entrance, a barrier of thick, entwined roots blocked their way. At Sera's silent command, the roots began to slither aside, the ancient wood creaking and groaning in response. The movement revealed a cavern beyond, its walls bathed in a soft, ethereal glow from the moss clinging to the stone. Each tiny patch of moss pulsed gently with a bioluminescent light, casting a serene, otherworldly ambience. The crowd gasped in unison. Some among them visibly trembled, their faces pale with fear. Zoha quickly stepped forward. There's nothing to worry about, just follow the prophetess. Sera moved next to the demoness and spoke with a soothing cadence. Fear not, these roots are the protectors of our sanctuary, a gift from goddess Sera herself. They respond only to my command and are here to ensure your safety. Several murmurs rippled through the crowd. One hesitant voice broke through, but what if something goes wrong? Sera turned to the speaker and managed to give a gentle smile. The goddess has blessed this place and given me the power to control it. You have seen the miracles already, and there is no need to fear. Trust in the goddess and in me, as her chosen prophetess. Her words resonated quickly with the crowd. Their doubt-filled murmurs faded, replaced by nods and whispered affirmations. The tension eased as their fearful looks softened into expressions of cautious trust. Follow me, Sera instructed, turning to lead the way. The crowd moved after her more confidently now as they descended into the dark cavern with the light of the bioluminescent moss guiding their way. Sera led them deeper into the dungeon until they reached a familiar magic circle etched into the stone floor. Please line up and wait here. Only 10 people can come with me at a time, she said, turning to face the group. The humans obediently formed a line. 10 volunteers stepped forward first, eager to follow. She guided them into the magic circle, and soon, they were enveloped in a shimmering light as the circle transported them to the lowermost floor of the dungeon. Sera repeated the process, returning to the upper levels to bring down more people in groups of 10. Each time, the magic circle activated with a radiant flash as the humans were transported. Eventually, Sera guided everyone to the lowest level of the dungeon, the mystic forest. The humans stood in awe at the heart of the vibrant landscape. Each plant appeared as if they hummed with life, their colors more vivid than any they had ever seen. In the midst of everything, a middle-aged man stepped forward. His worn clothes and weathered face spoke of a hard life, but his posture was upright, shoulders squared as if drawing strength from the beauty around him. Is this where we will stay from now on? Sera smiled warmly. Yes, this is your new home, a sanctuary blessed by goddess Sera. She then turned to Zoha and whispered. Is everyone accounted for? The demoness nodded, whispering back. Yes, mistress, everyone is here. Sera turned to face the crowd with a gentle expression as she took in the sight of her followers. "Thank you all for following me this far, it's been a remarkable experience." The crowd responded fervently as they chanted in unison. "For Goddess Sera, we swear our loyalty. Your faith is strong, and such great devotion deserves an equally powerful reward." She raised her hands high, fingers splayed, then closed her eyes for a brief moment. Her breath slowed just a bit as she channeled her magic. In an instant, the ground beneath the humans collapsed as countless thick roots erupted. Each root surged upwards with a terrifying force, impaling the humans in a synchronized motion. One young woman opened her mouth to scream, but a root pierced her chest, silencing her before the sound could escape. An elderly man raised his hand in a futile attempt to ward off the attack, was struck through the heart, eyes widening in shock. Everyone else was similarly impaled, faces frozen in expressions of horror. The roots retracted as swiftly as they had emerged, slipping back into the earth as if they had never been. Sera surveyed the scene with a detached satisfaction, unblinking as she took in the results of her work, dozens of dead humans, scattered on the forest floor. "Here's hoping to many more in the future." She turned to Zoha, who stood nearby. "Bring the bodies into the spirit tree's chamber." Zoha nodded. "Yes, mistress." The Elder Dryad positioned herself with her back against the young sapling. She took a deep breath as she prepared to synchronize with the growing tree. Slowly, she felt the first tender touch of roots emerging from beneath the soil. They brushed against her back with a delicate, yet insistent touch. A shiver ran down her spine as the roots explored her skin. Then, with a sudden thrust, the roots burrowed into her flesh. Her eyes snapped open as she let out a slight gasp. That was unexpected. Experience extraction complete. Core experience updated to 5,500. Rank up requirement from rank 2 to rank 3, 5,000 experience. Initiate rank up sequence? Yes, Sera whispered, still reeling a bit from the pain. Rank up sequence initiated, please wait. The spirit tree's silvery leaves emitted a radiant light. The sapling stretched upwards, growing with an audible creak of expanding wood and unfurling leaves until it stood just around the height of Sera's hips. Then, as quickly as it had flared, the light dimmed as the sapling returned to its natural state. At the same time, Sera felt a powerful surge of magic coursing through her, a wave of energy that tingled from the roots intertwined with her skin to the tips of her hair. Rank up sequence complete. Displaying dungeon status. Core rank, 3. Core experience, 500. Dungeon boss, Sera. Number of floors, 3. Mana, 300/400, 100 currently used for monster maintenance. Monsters, 22. New features unlocked, new terrain option, unlock E-tier monster, experience distribution. Interestingly, the system only noted down 22 monsters instead of 23. Sera reminded herself to have Zoha connect with the spirit tree later. But more importantly, the spirit tree finally gained the ability to distribute experience among monsters in the dungeon. Not sure if I will use the experience distribution feature anytime soon, but it is nice to have. Displaying experience distribution details. The experience distribution function enables the system to convert core experience into standard experience for other users within the dungeon. The conversion rate is presently set at 1:1. However, as the system's capabilities expand, a more favorable conversion rate will be available to users. Note that users who have reached level 300 cannot gain or receive experience through this method. Just as she thought, the experience conversion rate at the moment was still quite mediocre. Unless the conversion rate between core experience and normal experience improves significantly in the future, I don't see myself using experience distribution anytime soon. Instead, Sera was more curious about what new terrain option she unlocked. The first floor especially was rather barren, so it would be great if she could place a proper theme there. Initiating floor terrain alteration. Please select which number floor you wish to alter. First floor. Sera said. The first floor has been chosen as the target of terrain alteration, please review the available terrain options below. 1 basic theme, default option, unique passive, none. 2 stone maze, rank 2 option, unique passive, minor bonus to adventurer's fear. 3 glow moss cavern, rank 3 option, unique passive, slight possibility that glimmer cap mushrooms will sporadically emerge over time. Not too shabby. Sera recalled how glimmer cap mushrooms had the ability to temporarily stun or even paralyze someone who got too close to them. She wanted more of the dungeon to be able to produce these mushrooms, but the mystic forest on the third floor was still excellent. I'll just keep the mystic forest and altar floors 1 and 2 for now. Apply the glow moss cavern for the second floor as well please. Sera said. Request confirmed. Terrain modification on the second floor will proceed accordingly. Glow moss cavern selected. Initiating terrain alteration. Sera felt a slight tremor beneath her feet, a subtle vibration traveling through the soil and into the roots of the spirit tree's sapling. The tremble grew in intensity but never reached the point of discomfort this time. Terrain alteration complete. With that confirmation, Sera closed her eyes to sense the changes. The energy coursing through the dungeon was noticeably different now, pulsing with more vigor. Satisfied, Sera decided to check her monster creation options again. Hopefully I get something useful. Displaying monster unlock options. 1. Unlock 1 random F-tier monster, cost, 100 core experience. 2. Unlock 1 random E-tier monster, cost, 500 core experience. She had exactly 500 experience left, just enough for an E-rank monster. She selected the option, curious to see what monster she would get this time. Unlock 1 random E-tier monster selected. Processing request. New monster unlocked, Myconid Guardian. Level range, 45 to 55. Maintenance cost, 50 mana. Respawn time, 1 hour. Description: the Myconid Guardian is a large creature composed of intertwined fungal strands and thick, mushroom-like plates. Its body is covered with patches of bioluminescent fungi that glow in the dark. With the dungeon only having 300 mana left for Sera to spend, she figured it wouldn't be the worst idea to spread the Myconid Guardians evenly. A set for the first floor and then another set for the second floor. Where do you wish to spawn in the Myconid Guardians? The first and second floor please. Sera said. How many do you wish to spawn? 6 total, 3 on the first floor, and then another 3 on the second floor. Initiating Guardian Myconid spawn sequence. Spawning will occur at random locations within the designated floors. Last but not least, it was time to check her profile. Name, Sera. Species, Elder Dryad. Access privilege, Administrator. Level, 300. Magic, 300, rating, S. Magic resistance, 300, rating, S. Physical defense, 100, rating, C. Strength, 50, rating, E. Speed, 150, rating, B. Vitality, 300, rating, S. Overall challenge rating, S. Alert, Level 2 Winter Path Progression ability available. Processing Level 2 Winter Path Progression reward. New Winter Path ability unlocked, Frost Walk. Description: the user can create a trail of ice that follows them as they move, freezing any solid or liquid surface they walk upon. This ability can also allow the user to traverse water by freezing patches beneath their feet, effectively creating a path of ice as they move. Restriction: the user's feet must maintain direct contact with a solid or liquid surface for the frost path to activate. The ice trail ceases to form if the user is lifted off the ground or becomes airborne. Out of curiosity, Sera glanced down at the smooth limestone beneath her feet, focusing her energy to activate her newly unlocked ability. A chill pulsed through the air, and in seconds, a thin sheet of ice formed where she stood. She also noted that despite the visible frost, her feet didn't feel particularly cold at all. After walking around for a bit, Sera found that wherever she went, as long as she put her thought into it, a trail of ice would then follow her path. The ice didn't feel slippery to her, allowing Sera to walk on the crystalline surface as she would normal ground. Good to know that I won't make a fool out of myself when using this ability. Afterwards, Sera returned to her original position and willed the ice she conjured to rapidly sublimate and vanish. With that finished, it was time to check on the rest of the dungeon. She gently disentangled herself from the roots that had burrowed into her back. The tendrils retracted reluctantly, leaving faint gashes on her skin that rapidly healed. She took a moment to steady herself before she began to walk toward the exit. But as she walked, a sudden, searing pain shot through her head, as if an invisible force had pierced her skull. The intense headache forced her to stagger and then stumble as she reached out towards a nearby wall for support. Her vision blurred, but through the haze, words formed right in front of her eyes. Alert, unknown zone unlocked. Location, current floor. Administrator access only. Sera slowly pushed herself upright, leaning heavily against the wall to regain her balance. She rubbed her temples, trying to ease the discomfort while her thoughts raced. The fact she received words didn't make any sense, that shouldn't even be possible considering how she wasn't directly connected to the spirit tree anymore. Her grip tightened on the rough stone as she took a deep breath. She glanced back toward the spirit tree's sapling. Everything appeared normal, with no sign of any disruption or intrusion. Yet, the warning from the system lingered in her mind like a persistent echo. Though part of her warned against investigating the unknown zone, something even deeper within her mind commanded her to investigate. Chapter 15 Glimpse of the Past. Guided solely by instinct, Sera walked with an almost mechanical precision. Her mind was completely devoid of extraneous thoughts, with only a singular focus driving her forward. She stopped in front of a particularly dense cluster within the mystic forest. Several brightly colored trees crisscrossed with thick, curling vines. Their branches hung low, weighed down by droplets of dew. It was as if the entire forest had gone silent. The usual rustling and distant cries were replaced by an expectant stillness. Sera reached out a hand, her fingers trembling slightly as she neared the vibrant bark of one of the trees. The moment felt heavy with significance, the air charged with anticipation. Just as her fingertips brushed the surface, she heard a sound from behind her. "Are you all right, boss?" The Elder Dryad hesitated while her hand hovered inches from the tree. She turned slowly as she spotted Ermo approaching her from behind. "I'm fine, what are you doing here?" Ermo raised an eyebrow, his keen eyes observing her closely. "Just wandering around, and I saw Zoha heading out of the dungeon earlier for a walk." "That's fine, thank you for informing me. Speaking of, are you sure you're all right, boss? You looked weird while you were walking here." "I already told you that I'm fine, just go do whatever." "All right, I'll be around nearby." The beastkin bowed lightly before whistling a tune while walking away. Now alone, Sera turned back to the dense cluster of trees and raised a hand to channel her magic. The surrounding trees and foliage heeded her command. Branches creaked as they bent and stretched, weaving together like interlocking fingers until the wood formed the rough outlines of a portal. As the final branches settled into their appointed spots, the faint glow grew stronger. A surge of dark energy flowed through the portal, one that made it blatantly obvious how dangerous it was. Even still, Sera stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the portal. The vortex within reached out to her soul, beckoning her to step through. As soon as Sera crossed the portal, a foul stench slammed into her senses. The odor was nauseating, akin to a combination of both rotting wood and decomposing flesh. She took a moment to brace herself against the overwhelming scent as her eyes adjusted to the darkness. She was now in a sprawling swamp, one covered with gnarled trees and murky waters. Most of the trees were malformed, their bark peeling away to reveal sickly, decayed wood. All while the ground was a soupy mess of mud and stagnant water. Yet, the swamp was sparsely lit by white wisps that floated aimlessly through the air, their ghostly glow casting faint shadows across the landscape. Despite the extensive knowledge Sera can usually recall when it came to monsters, she had no clue what these wisps actually were or how they came into being. "I can barely sense any magic coming from them, are they even alive, or are my eyes just playing tricks on me?" Sera proceeded cautiously as she ventured deeper into the swamp. Ice coated the surface of the murky waters beneath her feet, forming a thin layer that cracked and reformed with each step. This frozen path allowed her to traverse the bog without sinking, but the foul stench that clung to the air did little to make her feel safe. As she walked, Sera focused her senses, trying to detect any hint of other creatures lurking in the shadows. The swamp was unnervingly silent. At one point, she heard a sharp crack behind her and spun around, only to find a broken piece of wood that had snapped off and fallen into the water. Eventually, a faint rustling caught her attention. She turned her head and eyed the dense foliage, but saw nothing. Then, from the opposite direction, a sudden splash broke the silence. This time, she spun quickly enough to catch a fleeting glimpse of antlers darting away into the darkness, their shadowy outline disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Sera raised her hand in the direction where she had seen the outline of antlers, focusing her magic through the decaying trees. The gnarled trunks and branches groaned as they parted. But as the trees shifted away, she heard a loud thud, as if they had hit something solid. A piercing screech followed, causing Sera to wince slightly. The noise was followed by a series of splashing sounds, echoing through the swamp as something moved quickly through the murky waters. Sera twisted the surrounding trees, shifting her field of view to try and catch whatever was stalking her. The forest reacted to her command, the branches bending and stretching as if searching with her. Finally, one of the branches wrapped around what appeared to be a leg, trapping it in a firm grip. The Elder Dryad's gaze followed the branch upward and nearly jumped back as she saw a tall, lanky creature. It walked on all fours, with long limbs ending in spindly fingers that clawed at the ground. Its torso was unnaturally skinny, the ribs visible beneath the taut skin. But what startled Sera the most was its head that looked almost exactly like her own face, complete with antlers, but was distinguished by a wide, unsettling grin. The creature shrieked again as it lunged at her. Its lanky limbs slapped away the foliage that blocked its path with surprising force. Sera commanded the roots and branches of the nearby trees to intercept the abomination's attack. The gnarled wood sprang to life, coiling towards the creature hastily. As she turned to run across the icy surface of the water, she heard the sickening snap of decaying wood being shattered by the abomination's force. She glanced back to see the creature breaking through her barriers with ease, its unsettling grin never wavering. Panic surged through her veins, driving her to move faster. But before she could gain any distance, 3 more of the abominations emerged from the shadows. They circled her like predators, eyes glinting with a malevolent intelligence. Sera made a quick cut on her hand using the sharp end of her antlers, hoping to summon her dark tendrils forward. She felt the familiar sting and flow of sap trickling down her palm, but nothing happened. The dark tendrils remained completely unresponsive. For the first time ever, Sera actually felt fear. How is it possible for me to be this weak? It's almost as if this place is draining me of my strength. Just as one of the abominations lunged at her, a sudden, bone-chilling cold filled the air. Sera's breath hitched as the temperature plummeted. The attacking creature froze solid mid-leap, encased in a thick, crystalline layer of ice as its grotesque features were locked in a snarl. The remaining abominations retreated swiftly into the darkness, their shadowy forms vanishing among the twisted trees. Their retreat was a swift blur of movement as they melted into the shadows, leaving Sera momentarily alone. Relief was fleeting as she tried to move, only to realize her legs were encased in ice up to her ankles. Panic surged through her as she struggled to free herself. She twisted and pulled, but the ice held firm, unyielding. A calm, authoritative voice cut through the swirling storm. I'd suggest against doing that. Sera glanced up and could only fall silent at what she saw. Before her stood a woman that appeared to be the source of the chilling cold. No, this doesn't make any sense. This woman was almost certainly another Elder Dryad, evidenced by the antlers that grew from her forehead. But unlike any antlers Sera had seen before, these were made of pure, crystalline ice. The new Elder Dryad's eyes were a mirror of Sera's, silvery and luminous. Her skin, too, was pale and almost luminescent, glowing subtly in the dim light of the snowy swamp. Yet, there were distinct differences. Her dress was a pristine white, blending seamlessly with the surrounding snow, and her hair reached only to her shoulders. The world felt as if it held its breath as the two Dryads stood face to face. The snow continued to fall, the flakes swirling gently in the air before settling softly on the ground. Sera felt a mix of awe and confusion as she looked at the Elder Dryad. Who are you? The Elder Dryad met Sera's gaze with a calm look. You may address me as Winter. Sera's eyes narrowed slightly. Is that truly your name? And were you the one who called me here? Winter remained composed, breath visible in the frigid air. Calm yourself. Do not exert too much energy, or else the enemy will notice. Who is this enemy you speak of? For your safety, I cannot reveal that information. Nor can I divulge my true name. What is this place, then? And why bring me here if you are not going to provide answers? Winter's gaze flickered around their surroundings. Follow me, she said, turning away and beginning to walk. I will not follow a stranger who speaks in riddles and refuses to even give a name. Sera said. Yet, Winter continued walking regardless. She only stopped for a brief moment to glance back at Sera. You will follow, because deep down, you seek the truth, and I am the only way to find it. For a moment, Sera stood frozen, watching Winter's retreating form. The cold felt as if it seeped deeper into her very being, a chill that went beyond the physical. Her breath misted in the air, mingling with the frosty tendrils that Winter left in her wake. It was impossible for Sera to stay still, there was something about Winter that spoke to her soul. It's as if I'm talking with myself, it feels odd, but not bad. Winter walked with an eerie grace, her steps light yet purposeful. With each step she took, the ground beneath her feet froze solid, the murky water transforming into a pristine sheet of ice. Sera watched in fascination as Winter's presence seemed to reshape the very landscape. Ice crystals formed on the branches, sparkling like diamonds in the ghostly glow of the floating wisps. The stagnant water turned into a mirror-like surface, reflecting the warped, gnarled trees. Out of curiosity, why am I not affected much by your frost? Sera asked. She could feel the intense cold radiating from Winter, yet it didn't seem to touch her. The icy air bit at her exposed skin but didn't freeze her as it did the rest of the swamp. Winter glanced over her shoulder. After thousands of years of experience rotting in this swamp, I have managed to hone my magic greatly. Sera's eyes widened in shock. Thousands of years? You lived in this place for that long. I had only lived for 4 years in the material world. And if you are not careful, you will share the same fate. How could you have only lived for 4 years in the material world? Winter raised a hand, signaling for Sera to be silent. She glanced around, looking around the darkened swamp with a wary gaze. We should move to somewhere safer. Eventually, Winter stopped in front of what appeared to be a wall of ice. With a dismissive wave of her hand, the ice shimmered and parted, revealing an entrance to a cave made entirely of glistening ice. Sera hesitated at the threshold, her instincts warning her against stepping into the unknown. Are you certain this is safe? Winter turned to face her. Of course it is. Just step inside. Taking a deep breath, Sera stepped into the cave. The interior of the cave was filled with furniture made of intricately carved ice filled the space, a grand table, elegant chairs and even a few shelves adorned with frozen trinkets. The air inside was cold but oddly comforting, the oppressive stench of the swamp replaced by a crisp chill. In the center of the room stood a table with a chessboard, the pieces differentiated by one set being a darker shade of ice while 2 chairs sat opposite each other. Winter sat down in one of the chairs and gestured for Sera to join her. Sit, let us play a game. Sera's eyes widened in disbelief. You said we don't have much time. Why are we playing chess? Winter's gaze was steely, her voice carrying an edge of pride. I set up the chessboard to teach you something important. Trust me, start playing. Reluctantly, Sera took a seat and began to move her pieces. As the game progressed, it became clear that Winter was a master of the game. Sera, despite her best efforts, found herself struggling to keep up as it only took a few moves before Winter had her in checkmate. Sera frowned. Why am I losing so easily? I've managed to get the hang of chess quickly before. Winter's lips curled into a cold, condescending smile. Where do you think you received your chess abilities from? What do you mean? I cannot reveal much, but you should know this, you are not the first Elder Dryad created by the Spirit Tree. And if you're not careful, you won't be the last. How many Elder Dryads has the Spirit Tree created, excluding the abominations in the swamp? Winter chuckled, a sound devoid of warmth. I never intended to count the living failures in the first place. However, there have been 4 Elder Dryads before you. You are the 5th. Do you know who the other 3 are? You will meet them in due time. Like you, I was created by the Spirit Tree to restore balance to the world. I destroyed mortal empires, fought off armies, and spread the influence of the Spirit Tree. My power was as unmatched as my purpose was clear. But what happened to you? Sera asked. Winter's gaze hardened, her voice turning bitter. In the 4th year after my creation, when most of the mortal empires had fallen, I simply died. Sera's breath caught in her throat. How did it happen? Winter's expression was unreadable. I cannot tell you how. Only that it was sudden and unexpected. Every other Elder Dryad after me has experienced the same fate, which will likely include yourself if you are not careful. How can I prevent this inevitable death, then? You must continue to become stronger, strong enough to defeat the foe that has been with you from the very beginning. Are you not referring to the mortal races? No, I am not. Then who or what is this enemy and how can I defeat it? Sera asked. But Winter sighed and shook her head. Unfortunately, as much as I wish to tell you, I cannot. What was the point of this entire conversation if you aren't going to say anything useful? Calm yourself. You will likely forget this entire conversation when you leave the swamp. However, all I hope to do is plant the seeds of doubt in your subconscious, so that hopefully, in the future, you will remember what you need to do. Sera stared at Winter, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. Doubt, frustration, fear, and a flicker of hope all churned within her. The idea that she might forget this conversation was infuriating, but the possibility that some part of it might stay with her gave her a strange sense of reassurance. Winter rose from her chair, the ice beneath her feet cracking softly. We must move on. There is still much for you to learn, and time is not on our side. Sera moved to follow Winter, her steps cautious on the icy floor. Suddenly, the ground shook violently, causing her to stagger. She grasped the edge of the table for support. What's happening? Winter's eyes flashed with urgency. Run! Before Sera could react, black roots burst out of the icy floor, impaling Winter through the chest and stomach. The Elder Dryad's eyes widened in shock, her mouth opening in a silent scream as the dark tendrils twisted and coiled around her. More roots erupted from the ground, snapping and thrashing like serpents. Sera didn't need further urging. She turned and fled while the icy ground splintered beneath her feet. The cave echoed with the sounds of Winter's strangled gasps and the violent thrashing of the roots. As she burst out of the cave and into the swamp, the foul stench of decay hit her senses again. She forced herself to focus, the terror in her heart driving her forward. The ground trembled beneath her, and she could hear the distant roars of the abominations. Sera moved quickly but cautiously. She ducked behind gnarled trees and crouched low in the dense foliage, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She paused behind a particularly thick tree, peering around it to survey her surroundings. In the distance, she saw the shadowy forms of the abominations, their antlered heads darting back and forth as they searched for her. Sera held her breath as she waited for them to move on. When the creatures finally moved away silently on the frozen ground. The portal was still some distance away, and she knew she had to be careful. One wrong move could give away her position. And I'm still not confident that I can take on any of those abominations myself. A sudden crack behind her made her freeze. She turned her head slowly, her eyes scanning the darkness. One of the abominations was moving closer, its antlers glinting in the faint light. Sera pressed herself against the tree and hoped for the best. The creature paused, its head tilting as if listening. Sera's heart raced, her mind racing on trying to figure out a way to distract it. When the abomination took a step closer, Sera reached out with her magic, coaxing the nearby roots to shift and create a distraction. The roots responded sluggishly, but it was enough. They rustled and cracked, drawing the abomination's attention. The creature turned its head, and Sera took the opportunity to slip away, moving as quickly as she could. Chapter 16 Price of Progress. Inquisitorial Headquarters. Chancellor Alastair sighed deeply, the sound barely audible above the distant clanging of swords and the low murmur of the spectators. His gaze was fixed on the training ring where Haziel stood over the lifeless body of her latest victim. Her rapier was slick and glistened with fresh blood, and her eyes held a wild, crazed glint as she surveyed her handiwork. Alastair's attention shifted momentarily as he brought a hand to his mouth, stifling a cough that echoed briefly in the otherwise tense silence. The sound snapped Haziel out of her trance-like state. She blinked a few times as she turned to face the Chancellor, her posture straightening in a semblance of respect. "Chancellor," she greeted. Alastair's eyes flicked to the fallen bodies around her. "Haziel, may I ask why you killed all of your sparring partners? I sensed demonic taint in them. Even the smallest hints of demonic taint must be extinguished before it spreads," Haziel said. Alastair resisted the urge to roll his eyes. He sighed again, shaking his head slightly. "First of all, you are an inquisitor, not a butcher. And killing people too quickly can actually be detrimental to future missions." Haziel's grip tightened on her blood-streaked rapier. "I reserve no mercy for the wicked. Haziel, I can't allow you to leave for the mission unless you get a better handle on yourself. Apologies, I'll try to exercise more control in the future. Have you at least managed to recover your abilities? To be completely honest, I'm still finding it difficult. It may take me quite a long time to regain my strength." Alastair turned away as he walked away. "Follow me, the acolytes have prepared something to help you." Haziel sheathed her rapier, the blade sliding into its scabbard with a soft hiss. She fell into step behind Alastair, boots echoing softly against the stone floor as he led her through a labyrinth of narrow corridors until they reached a set of heavy brass doors. Alastair pushed the doors open with a creak, revealing a dimly lit chamber with a massive, black, leafless tree at the center. Haziel's breath hitched as she took in the sight. The tree's bark was rough and gnarled, deep grooves and scars marring its surface. Metal bands encircled the trunk at irregular intervals, pulsating with a faint glow. The tree's roots spread out like dark veins, snaking across the ground and embedding themselves into the stone. Some roots were studded with crystalline shards that emitted a soft, otherworldly light, their glow reflecting off the wall. "Do you remember this tree?" Alastair asked, his voice echoing slightly. Haziel shook her head slowly. No, I don't. What is that thing? Alistair sighed softly. I'm not surprised you don't remember. This tree is a repurposed wild dungeon core. We've managed to transform it into something we can use for our own purposes. And what do you want me to do with it? You are to change out of your uniform and stand with your back facing the tree. The acolytes will do the rest. Soon, an acolyte entered the room, carrying a set of pristine white robes. The acolyte bowed his head slightly in respect as he extended the garments towards her. Haziel accepted the robes, feeling the smooth texture of the fabric against her fingers. Will the tree really be able to help me? Alistair stepped closer and placed a reassuring hand on Haziel's shoulder. This tree has been modified to help you channel and control your abilities. The process is demanding, but it will strengthen your connection to your power and aid in your recovery. Then, he stepped back, casting a brief gaze toward her. I'll be waiting in a different room. Good luck, Inquisitor. With that, Alistair pivoted and strode from the chamber, his acolytes trailing obediently behind him. The heavy brass doors swung shut with a booming thud that resonated through the cavernous space, the echo slowly fading into a silence that pressed down on Haziel. Once alone, she drew a deep breath as she moved towards a small alcove tucked into the chamber's side. The Inquisitor quickly shed her Inquisitor's uniform and changed into the pristine white robes. The new garment clung to her form, the unfamiliar texture leaving her feeling slightly vulnerable. Once her uniform was neatly folded and set aside, Haziel took another steadying breath. She turned then, her gaze drawn to the tree at the center of the chamber. The metal bands wrapped around its twisted trunk pulsed rhythmically as Haziel positioned herself with her back to the tree. The rough bark pressed through the thin fabric of her robes, grounding her in the present moment. Suddenly, the once placid roots of the tree twisted upon themselves with a sickening, serpentine life. A tremor of apprehension coursed through Haziel, breath hitching in her throat as a primal sense of danger set her nerves on fire. Before she could even flinch, razor-sharp black roots burst from the tree and pierced her back. Agony exploded within her, a searing, white-hot pain that tore through muscle and sinew, radiating outwards until her entire being was consumed by it. The intense agony warped Haziel's vision into a blur. A guttural scream ripped from her throat, echoing through the chamber like a wounded animal's cry. Yet, amidst the agony, a strange, pulsing energy began to emanate from the tree. The rough bark pressed against her back seemed to come alive, glowing with a deep, ethereal light. Haziel's skin responded as a radiant light spread across her body. The tree reacted to her, the metal bands and crystalline shards pulsing in sync with her heartbeat. Magical power surged through Haziel, a searing torrent that coursed through her veins like liquid fire. Muscles quivered, bones groaned, and her back arched involuntarily as the magic reached a fever pitch. Then, from the points where the roots pierced her flesh, a shimmering blue light emerged. Ethereal feathers made from pure magical energy unfurled rapidly. The wings grew at an astonishing pace, their edges sparkling like freshly cut gemstones as they gradually extended outward. At the same time, red lightning crackled across her skin, tracing a network of incandescent veins that pulsed with raw power. Each flicker of the lightning sent a jolt through her body that brought both exhilaration and agony. Soon, the roots that had impaled Haziel began to slowly retract. Haziel collapsed to the ground, her legs buckling beneath her while her wings folded awkwardly behind her. She panted heavily, each breath a laborious effort as her body struggled to adjust to the immense power it had just absorbed. The red lightning that had crackled around her dissipated, while her wings slowly dissolved into ethereal wisps before vanishing completely. The heavy chamber door swung inward with a drawn-out groan, breaking the silence that had enveloped Haziel. Chancellor Alistair strode into the room, flanked by a retinue of acolytes. Each attendant carried various trays containing salves, bandages, and an array of medicinal tools. Alistair approached Haziel, filled with a deep concern that belied his otherwise stoic demeanor. "How do you feel?" The Inquisitor's gaze flickered up to meet his, breath still hitching slightly. "I feel like I've been torn apart and put back together." The acolytes swiftly surrounded her and helped her sit up. One of them brought a soft cushion, placing it behind her back for support. Another began to apply a cool salve to the wounds left by the roots, the soothing balm easing the burning pain. "You did well," Alistair said, kneeling beside her. He watched as the acolytes worked, their hands moving with precision and care. They cleaned her wounds, applied more salves, and wrapped her injuries with clean bandages. This process was necessary to unlock your potential, but it was also incredibly taxing. "Your body needs time to recover." Haziel winced as an acolyte pressed a cloth soaked in antiseptic against a particularly deep wound. She felt the sting, but the pain was bearable compared to what she had just endured. I understand, Chancellor. One of the acolytes offered her a small vial of liquid. Drink this, it will help with the pain and aid in your recovery. Haziel took the vial with trembling hands and drank the contents. The liquid was bitter, but she forced it down, feeling its warmth spread through her body. It took a few minutes, but gradually, the pain dulled as it was replaced by a soothing numbness. After a few moments, Chancellor Alistair stepped closer, his eyes fixed on Haziel with a mixture of concern and expectation. Haziel, try to manifest your wings again. Haziel closed her eyes and focused on the new power within her. She could feel the residual magic from the tree's infusion pulsing through her veins. Slowly, she visualized the wings emerging from her back, their shimmering blue light growing brighter with each passing second. With a concentrated effort, she extended them fully, the wings unfurling in a radiant display. Opening her eyes, Haziel saw the ethereal wings spread out behind her. She turned to Alistair, gratitude shining in her eyes. Thank you for restoring my strength, I finally feel whole again. Alistair nodded, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. You've made great progress, but we still have much to do. Follow me. He turned and led her out of the chamber, the echo of their footsteps fading as they entered a different room lined with shelves. Each one was filled to the brim with all manner of scrolls and books. Alistair approached one of the shelves, fingers trailing across the spines of the books until he selected one with a worn leather cover. There's one last step for you, Haziel, you need to be conditioned again. But why? I've already undergone the ritual with the tree. An order is an order, Inquisitor. You will not question me. Haziel lowered her head. Apologies, Chancellor. What must I do? Alistair gestured towards a nearby wall. Stand there. The Inquisitor slowly moved towards the wall. The stone felt cold against her back as she pressed herself against it, bracing for what was to come. Soon, Alistair began to read from the book, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that filled the chamber. By the will of the Lizarian crown, let your spirit be tempered to better serve the greater good. As Alistair's voice washed over her, Haziel felt a peculiar warmth spread through her chest. The words seemed to vibrate within her, resonating with a deep part of her being. She closed her eyes and allowed the sound to envelop her. With each breath, embrace your purpose, with each heartbeat, align your soul to the will of Lizaria. Haziel's breathing slowed, her heart rate steadying as she focused on the cadence of Alistair's words. She felt a gentle pull, a tether drawing her deeper into a state of calm and obedience. Let the bonds of doubt and fear be severed, let your spirit be a vessel for the crown's will. Her muscles relaxed, the tension in her shoulders melting away. A serene placidity settled over her, dulling the sharp edges of her thoughts. She felt detached from her surroundings, yet acutely aware of the purpose being etched into her mind. Embrace the destiny that has been chosen for you, serve without question, for your path is clear. Haziel's mind felt light, the burdens of uncertainty lifting as the Chancellor's words guided her. Nothing else mattered, there was only the here and now, and the unwavering loyalty she owed. Alistair closed the book with a definitive snap before stepping closer to Haziel. What is your purpose? The Inquisitor opened her eyes slowly, her expression placid and her voice devoid of emotion. My purpose is to serve Lizaria and the Lizarian crown. Good, now we can finally move on. The Chancellor turned to one of the nearby shelves and retrieved a set of documents, neatly bound together. He then approached Haziel, holding the documents out for her to see. Your next mission, Inquisitor, is of utmost importance. You are to investigate the disappearance of Prince Leo and his expedition. Haziel's eyes, though calm, reflected a keen interest. What are the known details of the mission, Chancellor? Prince Leo departed on his expedition approximately 1 month ago with the goal of exterminating the last wild dungeon in existence. It was meant to be a simple event to boost morale at home, but of course, it has now turned into a disaster. What is the current hypothesis regarding their disappearance? The ongoing hypothesis is that something or someone must have awakened in the last wild dungeon and managed to eliminate Prince Leo and the expeditionary force. Haziel's brow furrowed slightly. Why is that the conclusion you've reached, Chancellor? Alistair sighed, rubbing his temples as he gathered his thoughts. We have considered and ruled out several possibilities. There has been no ransom demand, which would be expected if bandits or mercenaries were involved. Furthermore, there are no signs of struggle or ambush along their route, eliminating the likelihood of a surprise attack by local brigands. Additionally, the dungeon area has been scouted multiple times since their disappearance, and no traces of an external threat have been found. So, you believe that whatever happened to Prince Leo and his men occurred within the dungeon itself? Precisely, given the nature of wild dungeons, it's plausible that an ancient entity or powerful creature was dormant and has now awakened, posing a threat that Prince Leo and his force were unprepared for. I will need to review all the information myself to draw a comprehensive conclusion. Is there a place where I can set up an office for this investigation? Alistair nodded, gesturing towards another corridor. Yes, there is. Follow me. He led Haziel through the labyrinthine corridors of the inquisitorial headquarters until they arrived at a door marked with intricate symbols of the Lizarian crown. Alistair pushed it open to reveal a spacious, dimly lit room. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books and scrolls, and a large wooden desk sat in the center, illuminated by a single lamp. This will be your office for the duration of the investigation, Alistair said, his voice echoing slightly. You will have access to all the resources you need here. The documents detailing Prince Leo's expedition as well as records of past dungeon explorations are all at your disposal. Haziel surveyed the room briefly before nodding. Thank you, Chancellor. I will begin my work immediately. Chapter 17 Red Lightning. Haziel sorted through every document provided to her with inhuman speed. She constantly flicked through pages while her eyes darted back and forth. Maps were unfurled and studied as more and more documents piled up around her. Hours passed with Haziel neither resting nor eating, not that she needed such things to begin with. The only occasional distraction she had was her hair falling into her face, but she always managed to brush it aside without missing a beat. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of non-stop reading and analysis, Haziel placed the last of the reports Captain Roland had provided into perfectly aligned stacks. Her mind went to work, meticulously sorting through the information she had absorbed. She began to recap the details out loud. It always helps to hear information again with my own ears. Prince Leo's expedition commenced a little over a month ago, she began, tracing over the map laid out before her with a finger. Their objective was to exterminate the last wild dungeon, a mission intended to boost morale and demonstrate Lizaria's strength. She glanced at a detailed map showing the route taken by the prince and his men. The initial leg of their journey took them through the heartland of Lizaria, where they encountered no significant obstacles. Haziel's eyes narrowed as she focused on the next part of the journey. As they neared the border, they passed through several key strongholds, receiving support and additional resources. Reports indicate that morale was high, and the expedition was progressing on schedule. She paused, her gaze shifting to another document that detailed the crossing into enemy territory. The situation started to change as Prince Leo's party approached the territory of the neighboring Verlith Dominion. Despite the ongoing war, Prince Leo decided to press forward, believing that the importance of their mission justified the risk of going into enemy territory. The Inquisitor flipped through several reports that detailed minor skirmishes and encounters with Verlithian patrols. There were reports of brief engagements with Verlithian scouts and border patrols, but none of these encounters resulted in significant casualties or delays. The prince's forces were well trained and equipped, managing to repel these minor threats without much difficulty. She leaned forward slightly as she continued reading. Once the expedition crossed deeper into Verlithian territory, their progress became more challenging. The terrain was rugged and unfamiliar, however, there are no reports of major engagements with Verlithian forces, indicating that they managed to avoid significant confrontations. Haziel picked up a final document, her expression grave. The last recorded communication from Prince Leo's expedition was a message sent just before they entered the last wild dungeon. The message indicated that they were preparing to enter the dungeon and that all was proceeding according to plan. She placed the document back on the table, her eyes reflecting a mix of determination and concern. Looks like the Chancellor was right, there's something dangerous in that dungeon. Haziel placed heavy paperweights on top of the neat stacks she had made to keep them still. With that settled, the Inquisitor reached into her uniform and retrieved a small metal key. She approached the door to her office and inserted the key into the lock. The mechanism clicked softly as she turned the handle. Her boots echoed softly on the stone floor as she walked through the hallway. Yet, when she rounded a corner, she came face to face with a male acolyte. "Inquisitor," he greeted her with a respectful bow. Haziel nodded. "Take the documents on my desk and place them in the repository." The acolyte nodded eagerly. "Yes, Inquisitor. Right away." He hesitated for a moment, then asked, "If I may, what are you planning to do?" That is a matter for my ears alone. Haziel said. The acolyte bowed again. Be safe, and good luck. Thank you, Haziel said, her voice dismissive as she turned away from the young man. She approached the grand staircase that led to the rooftop, hands grazing the cool banister as she ascended. It was pleasant to feel the night air on the rooftop, cool and crisp against Haziel's skin. She paused for a moment, closing her eyes and savoring the refreshing breeze. The sky above was a deep, velvety black, studded with countless stars with the moon hung low. Haziel walked to the edge of the rooftop, and looked around her surroundings to ensure she was alone. A dense forest stretched out far below, its canopy a sea of shadows under the moonlight. She took a deep breath, the crisp air filling her lungs, and let her gaze wander over the treetops. The forest seemed to beckon her, its secrets hidden beneath the dark, leafy surface. Haziel's mind began to race with possibilities, her thoughts as restless as the shifting shadows below. Haziel took a deep breath and closed her eyes. As she concentrated, a bluish glow emanated from her back, pulsating gently before growing brighter and more intense. Ethereal wings sprouted from her shoulders with a wide flourish. Each feather was crafted from pure magic, shimmering with a radiant luminescence. The Inquisitor savored the sensation, the familiar weight and balance of the wings grounding her. This feeling will never get old. Soon, she opened her eyes and launched herself into the air, the force of her takeoff sending a gust of wind across the rooftop. Haziel relished the freedom, the sense of power and control that came with each beat of her wings. Somewhere within the Verlith Dominion, Haziel soared through the clouds at blistering speeds, her ethereal wings cutting through the misty vapor easily. The cold wind whipped against her face, but she barely felt it as her mind focused on the task at hand. The Inquisitor recalled the map she had studied and noted the distinct outline of a mountain range that served as a notable landmark. She adjusted her trajectory and descended towards the dense forest below. The canopy rushed up to meet her as she gradually slowed her descent. The forest was a sprawling expanse of green treetops undulating gently like a vast, living ocean. She hovered just above the canopy, the tips of the tallest trees brushing against the solace of her boots. Her wings gradually dissipated into wisps of shimmering energy. The light they cast grew fainter, fading into the darkness until only faint traces remained. Her boots touched the ground with a soft thud, the soil feeling slightly damp beneath her feet. She took a moment to adjust, her eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. Prince Leo's camp shouldn't be too far from here. Haziel moved slowly, only making the slightest of noise as she navigated the uneven terrain. After a few minutes, she spotted a clearing ahead. The remnants of a camp soon came into view as Haziel approached. This must have been the surface camp of Prince Leo's expeditionary force. Tattered tents flapped in the gentle breeze, fabric hanging limply from broken poles. Countless supplies were scattered across the ground, most trampled or broken. The remnants of a fire pit sat cold and unused with its ashes scattered by the wind. Haziel looked over the scene, eyes catching sight of a tattered banner lying partially buried under a collapsed tent. She knelt to examine it and brushed away the dirt to reveal the crest of Prince Leo, now stained and faded. Nothing of note just yet. The Inquisitor continued searching the rest of the camp for any clues or useful items. Yet, it quickly became apparent that anything of value had already been looted. She found empty chests, discarded bedrolls, and broken tools. The place had been picked clean. Despite the mess, one thing stood out to Haziel: there were no signs of bodies or casualties. It was as if the entire expedition had vanished without a trace. Doesn't look like even a single person made it out of that wild dungeon. I wonder what they encountered inside. But her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. Instead of running from the sound, Haziel moved closer to it as her hand hovered near the hilt of her rapier. She crept to the edge of the camp and peered through the dense foliage, spotting a group emerging from the forest. A small band of beastkin warriors with matted fur led the way, their armor was piecemeal at best. They were clearly fatigued from the way they walked, and their weapons were a mismatched collection of swords, axes, and spears with nearly dulled edges. In stark contrast, a lone elf mage trailed behind them. His pristine white robes shimmered in the light, embroidered with intricate runes that constantly glowed slightly every so often. He clutched a staff carved from a dark, polished wood. At the top of the staff, a crystal pulsed rhythmically, emitting a soft light. The elf's expression was one of disdain and superiority. When his gaze fell upon Haziel, his lips set into a thin, disapproving line. A Lizarian Inquisitor has no business being on the battlefield. Haziel drew her rapier, the blade gleaming slightly as it slid from its sheath. She held the weapon with one hand, fingers curled around the hilt with practiced ease as she positioned herself into a fighting stance. Enverlithians shouldn't interfere in Lizarian affairs. The elf mage waved his hand dismissively. Deal with her. The Beastkin warriors charged at Haziel all at once, their roars echoing across the battlefield. Muscles bulged beneath their fur-covered bodies, eyes filled with bloodlust that wasn't entirely natural. In response, Haziel channeled her magic, and red lightning crackled to life along the length of her rapier. The energy pulsed and sparked, casting a blood-red glow around her. A Beastkin lunged at her with a heavy axe raised high above its head. But Haziel sidestepped smoothly. Her rapier sliced through the air, and the lightning-imbued weapon cut through armor and flesh with ease, a sizzling sound accompanying the strike as the warrior crumpled to the ground. Another Beastkin came at her from the side, swinging a massive mace with enough force to shatter bones. But, with a casual flick of Haziel's wrist, she parried the blow. Sparks flew as the weapons clashed. In a few seconds, the Inquisitor saw her opening and thrust her blade forward. The Beastkin gasped, eyes widening in shock as the rapier pierced its heart. Every other Beastkin that approached met the same fate as they dropped like flies. The red lightning around her blade cast a macabre glow over the fallen warriors, their bodies strewn across the ground. Yet, as she pulled her rapier from the last of the Beastkin warriors, Haziel heard the sound of chanting. She turned her head to see the elf mage pointing his staff at her, his lips moving rapidly in an incantation. Before she could react, the crystal atop his staff flared brightly as a bolt of lightning shot out and struck the Inquisitor in the stomach. The force of the impact knocked Haziel back, her body skidding across the ground until she came to a rolling stop. Pain surged through her, but she pushed herself up and locked her eyes onto the elf mage, who was already chanting again. Gritting her teeth, Haziel clenched her left hand and manifested her left wing, its ethereal blue feathers shimmering with magic. She brought the wing in front of her, using it as a shield just as another torrent of lightning erupted from the elf mage's staff. The lightning slammed into her wing, sending tremors through her body. She braced herself, feeling the energy pulsing against her, but her wing held firm. The magical feathers absorbed the lightning, diffusing its power and protecting her from harm. She could feel the strain of maintaining her wing shield, but she refused to falter. The mage's chanting grew louder, the bolts of lightning more powerful, but Haziel's resolve only strengthened. The instant Haziel felt the lightning strikes stop, she dissipated her wing and dashed towards the elf mage. The mage's eyes widened in panic as he desperately tried to chant again. Haziel closed the distance between them in a heartbeat. Just as the staff started to glow again, she thrust her blade forward and pierced the mage's stomach, driving through with a sickening crunch. The glow of the staff flickered and died, the spell dissipating as the mage's concentration shattered. The Inquisitor twisted the blade and drove it deeper before pinning the mage to the ground. His breath left him in a pained gasp. The elf mage's hands grasped weakly at the hilt of the rapier, fingers slick with blood. His chanting had ceased entirely, replaced by a gurgling choke as he struggled to draw breath. Haziel's expression remained impassive, eyes devoid of mercy as she looked down at him. Glory to Lizaria! Haziel watched as the life faded from his gaze, his body going limp beneath her. Then, she pulled her rapier free with a swift motion, the blade still slick with blood. She stood over him for a moment, her breathing steady as she assessed the scene. The Inquisitor wiped the blood from her rapier with a swift flick, the red lightning fading from its surface. Leaving the now silent camp behind, Haziel walked through the forest. The trees thinned out as she approached what had once likely been a large opening in the earth, resembling a cave mouth. Now, however, it was completely covered with dirt and rocks, the entrance to the dungeon completely obscured. She approached the covered entrance and knelt down, brushing her fingers against the cold, rough surface of the rocks. She tested their stability, trying to see if she could pry any of them away, but it was all too clogged up. Determined to uncover the entrance, Haziel stood back and extended her hand, her fingers crackling with red lightning. The Inquisitor unleashed a blast of red lightning at the rocks, the air sizzling with the force of her attack. The rocks exploded outward, shards flying in all directions. For a moment, she glimpsed the dark, gaping maw of the dungeon entrance. But almost immediately, more rocks and dirt tumbled down, filling the gap she had created. Haziel's eyes narrowed in frustration. She tried again, channeling even more of her energy into a powerful blast. The result was the same, the rocks disintegrated, only to be replaced by a fresh cascade of debris. Doesn't look like I can use brute force to get inside. She stood up and looked around the area for any signs of bodies or further clues. The ground around the blocked entrance was undisturbed, and there were no signs of a struggle or any remains. It was as if the earth had swallowed the expedition whole, leaving nothing behind. Frustration gnawed at her as she realized her search had turned up nothing. There were no clues, no signs of what had happened to Prince Leo and his men. The mystery of the dungeon deepened, and Haziel knew she needed to explore further. Still, with nothing else for Haziel to see here, it was best for her to leave. She took a deep breath to calm her mind. A familiar warmth spread through her body, and the air around her shimmered as she manifested her wings again. With a powerful thrust, Haziel launched herself into the sky. The documents I read before mentioned that there was one adventurer who joined the expedition. Perhaps I should look into the Adventurers Guild next. Chapter 18 Rolling Thunder. Outside Sera's dungeon. Shrike released a heavy sigh, his shoulders slightly sagging as he approached the camp. His men were scattered haphazardly around the clearing, a disordered contrast to their uniform appearance. Each soldier wore the same vibrant red cloak he did, emblazoned with a stark black eagle on the back. Their armor from breastplates to steel-capped boots caught the fading light from the sunlight that filtered through the forest canopy above. Despite the uniformity of their attire, the camp itself was in disarray. Several soldiers lounged carelessly on rough-hewn logs with tankards of beer clutched loosely in their hands, amber liquid sloshing over the rims with every hearty laugh. Others reclined against their rocks and tree trunks as they lost themselves in tales and crude jokes. If Shrike had his way, he'd have fired over half the squad a long time ago, but he's a man who works with what he has been given. Shrike stopped right in the middle of his men. He tightened his grip on the shaft of his metallic spear and brought it down with force against the hard-packed soil. The impact produced a thunderous boom and was accompanied by an electrical shockwave that surged outward. The raucous laughter choked off mid-sound, and the careless sloshing of beer halted as if frozen in time. Every man jolted to alertness as they scrambled from their makeshift seats and slouched positions. The campsite filled with the clatter of armor and the hurried shuffle of boots as the soldiers snapped to attention. Their postures straightened as their eyes focused forward. Shrike paced deliberately in front of his men, pausing to look each of the 10 soldiers arrayed before him in the eyes. Listen up. I know everyone's excited for today's mission, but you all need to stop fucking around, understood? His men snapped to even straighter postures. Yes, boss. With a satisfied nod, Shrike tapped his spear against the ground once again, sending a minor tremor through the soil. Grab your shock spears, along with your light and firestorm runes, we're going into the dungeon immediately. The men sprang into action, each swiftly grabbing their gleaming metallic spears. They then reached for small, leather pouches that jingled with the sound of enchanted runes. Shrike took the lead as he cut a path through the dense forest. The underbrush gave way to his passage, branches and leaves rustling softly in his wake. Soon, he spotted what he had thought to be the entrance to a dungeon. However, as Shrike's gaze fell upon the entrance, his confident stride faltered. Where there should have been a traditional wooden or stone gate, he saw a barrier made from intertwining roots instead. The fuck? Don't think I've ever seen a dungeon entrance like that before. He turned sharply to the man on his right. Wesley. Did we go the wrong way? Wesley frantically pulled out a crumpled map from a leather sling bag slung over his shoulder. He unfolded it hastily, eyes darting between the paper and the root barrier. I'm pretty sure this should be it. Shrike eyed the dungeon entrance once more as he tried to make sense of the anomaly. Stay behind me. I'll try to get a better look. He moved towards the dungeon's peculiar entrance cautiously, tightening his grip around the shaft of his spear, the polished metal cool and reassuring under his fingers. Then, he pushed the sharp tip of his spear into the roots. With each press, a curious thing happened, the roots unfurled and slunk back to the ground as if responding to the touch of the spear. The more he pressed, the more the roots withdrew, slowly revealing glimpses of the dark interior of the dungeon. Turning to face his men, Shrike saw them straighten up under his intense gaze. All right, the dungeon seems to have changed a little bit, but the mission stays the same. We take the dungeon core and get out. Any questions? Boss, what about the beastkin shifter? Heard the one in this dungeon might be pretty strong. One of his men said. Relax, this dungeon is still new and hasn't been opened to the public yet. Means that the monsters will be weaker, and if we just go for the head of the guardian beast, we'll be fine. But aren't those shifters usually really strong? And we have a full squad with shock spears and firestorm runes, what's your point? And nothin', boss. Shrike slammed his spear against the ground again, creating a small shockwave that rippled through the air. We're doing one last weapon test and then we're going in, move. The men quickly scrambled into position, each gripping their shock spears. They aligned their weapons as they aimed at various trees encircling the clearing. Shrike paced deliberately in front of his men as he meticulously inspected each soldier's stance and equipment. Remember, we got these spears from the Royal Guard, and they didn't sell them for cheap. If any of them break, it's coming right out of your cut for the month. As his eyes roved over the line of soldiers, Shrike's keen gaze caught a flaw. Wesley's spear was angled a few degrees too low, the point directed towards the ground, a sloppy mistake that could prove costly. Damn idiot! Shrike approached Wesley and exhaled loudly. When we fight a beastkin shifter, do you really think we're gonna kill it by shooting the ground? Wesley's eyes widened, he frantically adjusted his spear and raised it to a more appropriate level. And no, boss. Shrike sighed deeply, a mix of frustration and resolve crossing his features. He then positioned himself, his own spear aimed at a sturdy oak tree. Everyone! On my mark! Ready! Upon Shrike's command, every single shock spear's rune-covered tip pulsed with electrical energy. The air around them crackled audibly, blue arcs of electricity dancing wildly as the energy built to a crescendo. Fire! A torrent of lightning blasts erupted from the tips of the shock spears in unison. The lightning struck the surrounding trees with devastating force, many of the trunks exploding into splinters as the powerful energy cleaved through them. The air was filled with the deafening sounds of splintering wood and the thunderous crashes of toppling timber. The interiors of the trees were exposed by the blasts, glowing and intense red-hot from the searing energy. Steam hissed violently from the shattered trunks, and thick, acrid smoke billowed upward as the sap inside the trees boiled furiously. Gradually, the once vibrant glow of the scorched wood dulled back to its charred state while the pungent smell of charred bark lingered in the air. Shrike lowered his spear. Spears down! His men followed his command without hesitation. As they settled their weapons, Shrike tapped the butt of his spear against the ground rhythmically as he walked towards the dungeon entrance. He paused, turning to address his squad with a stern look. One last thing, don't fuck with the firestorm runes unless absolutely necessary. They're expensive and each pouch only has one. Got it, boss. The men responded in unison. Suddenly, Shrike tensed, his sharp eyes catching a glimpse of movement behind his men. A figure clad in a black cloak and covered in bandages walked silently towards them. The eerie sight almost made Shrike's heart skip a beat. Shrike's men noticed his reaction and quickly turned around, aiming their shock spears at the approaching figure. The air crackled with tension, the men ready to unleash their weapons at a moment's notice. Stand down, Shrike commanded, stepping forward with a measured pace. His eyes narrowed as the figure drew closer. Zoha! The figure stopped and waved a hand, a familiar voice emerging from beneath the hood. It's been a while, another dungeon core heist. Shrike let out a hearty laugh, the tension in the air dissipating slightly. That depends, he said, his tone lightening. Are you the one they paid to guard it? You could say that I have an arrangement like that, yes. How much do you need to look away this once? Zoha tilted her head, a playful grin spreading across her face. Tell you what, Shrike. I'll do you a favor and won't interrupt this time. She stepped closer, her presence almost palpable. Leaning in, she whispered into his ear, her breath warm against his skin. When you inevitably fail, I'll be there to watch. Before Shrike could react, Zoha vanished into a swirling cloud of flies. The sudden transformation drew confused and fearful gasps from Shrike and his men. The flies buzzed around them for a few seconds before dispersing into the air. Shrike blinked, his mind racing to process what had just happened. He turned to his men, their expressions mirroring his own confusion. Since when could Zoha do that? And what in the fuck kind of magic was that? What was that? One of the men asked. Should we just back off? Another man suggested. Calm down, we're not going anywhere. We have a job to do. Shrike said. His expression hardened into one of resolute determination. He turned around and reached for his spear. His muscles tensed, ready for action. Let's move. When Shrike and his men entered the dungeon, they stuck close together, spears poised in all directions. The cavern they found themselves in was draped with a thick carpet of glowing moss, casting a soft light that barely pierced the encompassing darkness. Shrike raised his hand and signaled to his men. Light runes, now. His men immediately reached into their pouches, withdrawing small yellow runes. They all crushed the runes in their hands, the brittle material crumbling easily. And almost instantly, a mote of yellowish light materialized before each of them, hovering in the air and casting a warm glow that lit up the cavern more fully. With the newfound light, Shrike took a few cautious steps forward to get a better look at his surroundings. There was nothing of note just yet. Shrike lowered his hand, signaling to his men. "We're clear for now, let's go." The men relaxed their stances slightly but remained vigilant as they walked in a more relaxed state. Shrike constantly eyed the surroundings, alert for any hint of danger. To his surprise, not a single monster attacked even as his men made it further and further into the dungeon. That was, until one of his men yelled out a warning, "Incoming! 9 o'clock!" Instantly, Shrike and all his men pointed their spears to the left. Their armored boots crunching against the ground. From the shadowy corners of the cavern, a massive bipedal creature lumbered into view. It was a terrifying blend of the organic and the monstrous, composed of intertwined fungal strands and thick, mushroom-like plates that acted as a form of natural armor. Its movements were slow but each of its steps caused the ground to tremble slightly under its weight. The moment it stepped closer within striking range, Shrike yelled. "Fire!" A barrage of lightning shocks erupted from the tips of the shock spears, the air crackling with raw electrical energy. Each bolt seared through the dimly lit cavern as they struck the fungal creature. The impacts bored through its spongy flesh, creating sizzling holes that illuminated the cavern with each flash. With every strike, sections of the creature's body blackened and crumbled into ashen fragments. The creature convulsed violently under the assault, its form disintegrating piece by piece until it finally collapsed to the ground with a heavy, wet thud. As the dust settled, the creature's corpse rapidly transformed into ethereal wisps of blue mana. Several items dropped onto the now scorched cavern floor, a glistening brown sphere, roughly the size of a large apple, as well as several sizable chunks of mushroom plates, their edges still smoldering from the intense heat of the lightning blasts. One of Shrike's men approached the new loot, first reaching for the orb to examine it closely. He turned it over in his hands, feeling its weight and texture. "Any of you think this one is bigger than usual?" Shrike approached the man and gestured with his free hand, indicating that he wanted a closer look. "Let me see that." The man handed over the orb obediently. Shrike raised it to his eye level, scrutinizing the shimmering surface and the faint pulsing light within. "I've seen bigger monster cores, but for how easy that one was to kill. I suppose it is rather large." He then handed the orb to Wesley. "Pack it up." Wesley nodded and quickly opened his sling bag, carefully placing the monster core inside. As he cinched the bag shut, his gaze shifted to the scattered mushroom plates strewn across the cavern floor. "What about those things, boss?" Shrike approached the mushroom plates. He bent down and picked up one of the larger plates, his spear tucked securely under his armpit to free his other hand. Holding the plate up, he flexed it gently, testing its resilience and noting the texture and weight. He then tapped on its surface with his knuckles, listening intently to the hollow sound it produced. The plate's durability and structure wasn't too shabby, perhaps it could be made into something useful. He handed the mushroom plate to Wesley. "It's decent material, maybe the smiths back in the underground can work it into something." While Wesley packed up the plate, Shrike took the opportunity to survey their surroundings. He took a few steps forward, sweeping across the cave as his men continued to scout the area. "Anyone find anything else useful?" One of his men stepped towards him, shaking his head in response. "We got nothing for now, boss." Shrike grunted, signaling his readiness to move deeper into the cavern. His men followed suit, eyes scanning the dimly lit surroundings as they advanced. The oddest thing so far to Shrike was the scarcity of monsters within the dungeon. They did eventually encounter 2 more of the mushroom creatures, similar to the first. However, these encounters were not much of a challenge as the monsters were quickly dispatched without any trouble. Didn't think this dungeon would be this easy. Other than the mushroom creatures, the cavern was eerily devoid of further monstrous presence. All of it felt very wrong to Shrike, because he was told that this dungeon housed a particularly large dungeon core. Even if the core was relatively new, he would expect for at least human guards to be present while the core generated new monsters in the meantime. Yet, his thoughts were cut short when he spotted a large opening in the cave wall ahead. It was partially obscured by thick roots, similar to those at the entrance. A wave of unease washed over him at the sight, but the promise of the substantial payoff from securing the dungeon core spurred him on. "Can't turn back now." He tapped the butt of his spear against the ground to capture his men's attention. "Heads up, boys, we're going in there next." As Shrike and his men neared the root-entangled opening, their presence elicited a response from the living barrier. Gradually, the dense weave of roots pulled back to reveal the chamber room beyond. They stepped into the chamber cautiously, their eyes immediately drawn to an intricate magic circle inscribed on the floor. And at its center was a delicate silver flower. The chamber itself was dimly lit, walls lined with bioluminescent moss. The men exchanged puzzled glances as they approached the magic circle. One of them tentatively stepped into the circle, boots scraping against the cavern floor. "What do you think this is, boss?" Another soldier crouched down to inspect the silver flower. "This some kind of display or what?" "Be careful," Shrike warned, stepping closer. "We don't know what we're dealing with here." Shrike stepped into the circle himself, spear held tightly in his hand. He turned slowly, scanning the chamber for any signs of danger. Until suddenly, a disembodied voice echoed through the room. "Do you wish to be taken to the next floor?" Shrike gripped his spear tighter. "Who said that? Do you wish to be taken to the next floor?" Shrike exchanged a bewildered glance with his men before nodding decisively. "Just get in the damn circle." The soldiers hesitated for a moment before obeying, stepping into the circle and forming a tight cluster around the silver flower. Take us to the next floor," Shrike said, his voice firm despite the uncertainty gnawing at him. "Please remain calm and stay within the circle." A bright light enveloped them, the intensity of it causing them to squint and shield their eyes. They soon felt weightless as their bodies were teleported away. While his vision cleared, Shrike almost stumbled as the abrupt shift from one environment to another left him disoriented. Instinctively, he reached up, clutching his head with one hand as he fought to regain his balance. The cavern around him looked similar to the one they had just left, covered with faint traces of glowing moss. "What happened?" "Pretty sure we got teleported, boss," Wesley groaned beside him, clutching his own head as he tried to steady himself. While the rest of his men slowly gathered themselves, Shrike leaned on his spear for support and used it as a makeshift staff to help him walk forward. Despite the shock of their sudden displacement, the men quickly regained their composure, checking their equipment and readying themselves for whatever was ahead. The new floor appeared to be much the same as the first. It even had the same 3 mushroom creatures they had encountered before, stationed as if guarding the area. These were dispatched swiftly in much the same manner as before, allowing Shrike and his men to pick up the drops and move on fast. But eventually, one of Shrike's men ventured too close to a particularly glowy mushroom. As he extended his hand to touch the radiant fungi, it suddenly detonated with a soft pop and released a burst of glittering spores. The soldier's eyes widened in shock as he inhaled the spores, his body seizing up almost immediately. He collapsed to the ground, his limbs stiffening into a rigid, unresponsive state. The cavern was momentarily filled with frantic activity as his comrades rushed to his side. One soldier quickly uncorked a vial of potion and poured it carefully into the fallen man's mouth. For a tense minute or two, the paralyzed soldier remained motionless. But gradually, the potion took effect. His eyes blinked rapidly as awareness returned, his breath evening out as he regained control of his limbs. Regrouping after this unexpected setback, Shrike led his men deeper into the cavern. Soon, they reached another opening, this one leading to a familiar-looking magical circle. Wesley, recalling the previous encounter, half-joked, "Should we ask it again to take us to the next floor?" Immediately as before, the panel responded. Within moments, the familiar sensation of dematerialization overtook the group as they were enveloped in blinding light. The next thing Shrike knew, he found himself standing within a truly enchanting forest. The trees here were unlike any he had ever seen, their trunks broad and twisting high into the air. But before he had too much time to take in his mesmerizing surroundings, a rustling sound snapped him back to reality. Instinctively, Shrike raised his spear toward the source of the noise, his men quickly following his lead, their weapons poised and ready. A figure emerged from the dense underbrush. It was a grey-furred beastkin who looked like he came straight from the slums. Shrike's guess was that the beastkin was likely owned by another adventuring party using him as a pack mule. Regardless, Shrike wasn't aware that any other adventuring party was supposed to be here with him, unless his informant lied to him. "Where are your masters, doggy?" The beastkin clenched his fists. "None of you should be here." Despite the tension, Shrike couldn't help but chuckle at the beastkin's warning. "Are you lost? Because we got bigger fish to fry." The beastkin's eyes narrowed. "I'm warning you, this isn't going to end well. Wait a minute, did your party get to that dungeon core before us? Go eat a dick." Shrike let out a snort of derision as he glanced at Wesley. "Make the doggy talk." Wesley nodded and primed his spear, the tip crackling with building electrical energy. As the beastkin tried to dodge behind a nearby tree for cover, Wesley released the charged shot. The blast of lightning streaked through the air and struck the beastkin's leg. The energy shredded through muscle and bone, nearly destroying the limb instantly. The beastkin howled in pain and anger, collapsing to the ground as his leg gave out under him. Chapter 19 Rampage. Shrike laughed as he watched the beastkin writhing in the dirt. The poor thing clutched desperately at its leg where the muscle had been torn open. Dark blood soaked the earth, matting the thick fur and painting the ground in viscous streaks. His men were just as amused, if not more so. They might have hesitated if they had encountered a beastkin woman instead, but a regular beastkin man didn't exactly have much value. Slave market is too flooded these days. But suddenly, Wesley looked around nervously, searching the shadows for something. "Boss, I don't see the beastkin shifter anywhere." Shrike patted Wesley on the back. "Don't worry. The beastkin shifters that are placed in dungeons are usually already transformed, dumb, large, and loud. We should find it eventually." "But what if the beastkin we just shot was a shifter?" Wesley asked. Shrike couldn't help but let out a smug chuckle. "Don't be ridiculous. Not every beastkin you see is a shifter. You'd drive yourself mad thinking that way." His laughter filled the clearing, echoed by the chuckles of his other men. But soon, Shrike's laughter strangled suddenly in his throat as an overwhelming wave of energy surged from behind. The force rippled through his body, causing his knees to buckle as tremors resonated deep within his bones. He could feel the ground beneath him shudder as his men were caught in the blast, their bodies flung to the ground like ragdolls. An intense, searing heat enveloped them, scorching their skin and stealing the breath from their lungs. Shrike's vision blurred momentarily, but he managed to force his gaze toward the source of the explosion. His heart pounded against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in his chest. The beastkin from earlier had somehow regenerated its leg and was now glowing with fiery energy. His body swelled, muscles expanding, and skin stretching taut as he grew larger and larger. Shit! The ground around the beastkin cracked and splintered under the pressure of his transformation, jagged fissures spreading outward like a web. The air vibrated with raw power, the intensity of it making Shrike's teeth chatter. Before Shrike's eyes, the beastkin turned into a colossal beast. It first began with the skeleton, each bone snapping and clicking into place. Then, muscle and sinew grew around the skeletal structure, strands of flesh weaving together with disturbing speed, each layer forming with a wet, sinewy sound. Gradually, the creature's face took shape as one half of its visage was complete, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth set in a feral snarl. Each newly formed muscle twitched as the beast's emerging eye glinted with a predatory gleam. Shrike desperately forced himself upright, shaking off the shock that gripped his limbs. He planted his feet firmly on the ground and barked a command to his men, who were scrambling to their feet. "Shoot the damn thing!" As the beast's form continued to swell, Shrike and his men braced themselves for the imminent fight. Each one tightened their grip on their spear, tips crackling with arcs of blue-white lightning that surged along the shafts. In a split second, the shock spears unleashed their lethal payloads, arcing through the air toward the beast's massive head. The lightning bolts struck with devastating force, tearing through flesh and bone in explosive bursts. The beast's thick hide sizzled and smoked, chunks of muscle and shards of bone flying in all directions. Despite the relentless assault, the core structure of the beast's head remained disturbingly intact. Its grotesque visage now sported a gaping, raw wound, the torn flesh and exposed sinew framing a pulsating brain. Shrike's eyes widened as he took in the sight. The beast's resilience was beyond anything he had anticipated. Blood and viscera dripped from the horrific wound, steaming as it hit the ground. "How, is that thing not dead? We need to hit it again," Shrike barked. "Aim for the brain." The men readied themselves once more, the blue-white lightning dancing along their spears intensifying. Each warrior took aim, focusing on the pulsating brain exposed in the beast's head. With a collective shout, they unleashed the energy from the tips of their spears. The air sizzled with energy as bolts of lightning arced toward the target, tearing through the beast's flesh with explosive force. Chunks of brain matter, muscle, and bone were ripped away. Each strike appeared to weaken it momentarily, but it only took seconds for the flesh to knit itself back together and quickly regenerate. "Keep firing!" Shrike commanded, his own spear crackling with a ferocious charge. He hurled it with all his might, the lightning-infused weapon striking the beast's exposed brain with a brilliant flash. The creature howled in pain, but refused to fall. Even as its body was torn apart by the onslaught, the beast continued to regenerate. The ground shook as the beast roared and turned abruptly, going deeper into the forest and crashing through the underbrush, setting it aflame. Amidst the blaze, Shrike carefully kept track of the beast's movements. He aimed his spear at the monster in spite of the flames, the heat searing his skin and the smoke stinging his eyes. "Keep shooting!" Galvanized by Shrike's command, his men activated their spears again. Each lightning strike hit with a resounding crack against the beast, tearing through its flesh in explosive bursts. Chunks of smoldering meat were ripped from its frame, but the beast's momentum remained relentless. Its movements didn't slow one bit, almost as if it was fueled by sheer fury. With a roar that shook the nearby trees to their roots, the beast charged again. In a heartbeat, Shrike dove to the side, narrowly escaping the beast's lethal charge. The sheer force of its passage whipped the air around him, and he felt the intense heat scorch his skin. Several of his men also threw themselves into the relative safety of the trees. The foliage provided scant cover, but it was enough to avoid the beast's immediate wrath. A few brave souls stood their ground and pulled out their red firestorm runes, the edged symbols glowing ominously in their hands. In a synchronized effort, they hurled the runes at the advancing beast. The runes detonated mid-air, a series of fiery bursts that lit up the entire area with a searing brilliance. The explosions were deafening, sending shockwaves through the forest. For a moment, it looked as though the power of the runes might have done the trick. But when the smoke cleared, it was clear that the beast did not fall. Instead, it shook its massive head, dislodging the flames and smoke clinging to its fur. The firestorm runes had left scorch marks and smoldering patches on its hide, but the beast's eyes burned with a renewed anger. The beast pawed at the ground, kicking up dust and debris as it prepared for another lethal charge. Its muscles tensed, rippling under its thick fur. In a desperate attempt to stop the beast, Shrike activated his shock spear and aimed it directly at its head. "Come on, come on!" But unfortunately, he missed and accidentally struck one of the beast's hind legs instead. And immediately after, the beast lunged and snapped its jaws around two of Shrike's men, crushing them with a wet crunch. Afterwards, the beast turned and went deeper into the forest. The remaining men fired their lightning blasts at its retreating form, each strike lighting up trees and bushes but failing to bring the beast down. By this point, smoke erupted from the tips of some of the men's spears. Wesley cast a worried glance at Shrike. "Boss, we're already down a few spears." Shrike grunted in frustration and shoved Wesley aside. "Calm down. That thing has to be close to dying." Yet, Shrike turned his head as he heard the pained screams of his men. He spun around just in time to see a torrent of searing flames erupting from the underbrush, engulfing two of his men in flames, their bodies writhing as the fire consumed flesh and bone alike. Shrike had no time to worry about his men. He locked his eyes onto the beast as it was charging toward another group of his men, each stride igniting the ground beneath it. He gripped his spear tightly, feeling the weapon's residual power thrumming through his hands. Despite the spear's evident strain, he raised it high and unleashed a flurry of lightning blasts at the rampaging creature. One bolt struck the beast's head with a crackling burst of energy, while the other two slammed into its massive body. The headshot was particularly effective, causing the beast to stagger and its furious roar to morph into a pained howl. Yes. This brief reprieve was enough to force the beast to reconsider its assault. Soon, it turned and fled into the burning forest again. Shrike's natural reaction was to ready his shock spear and fire again. However, he soon noticed a thin pillar of smoke erupted from the tip of his weapon. "Fuck me, looks like I'll only have a couple of shots left." Shrike's remaining men regrouped and formed a loose defensive circle around him. Their eyes fixed on the burning beast that loomed ominously. They fired occasional bursts of lightning at the creature, their attacks now measured and cautious, conserving their weapons' dwindling power for a decisive strike. But as Shrike prepared to take aim, a sharp pain pierced his neck. He winced, instinctively reaching up to find a thorny, vine-like creature latched onto his skin. The sensation was swiftly followed by the pull of similar creatures anchoring themselves to his legs, their tiny, spiky bodies digging into his flesh. Panic flared in his eyes as he shouted, "Somebody! Get this little shit off me!" Wesley drove his spear into one of the vine creatures. The creature disintegrated into a wisp of mana, leaving behind a small green sphere. Then, Wesley turned his attention to Shrike, deftly removing the remaining creatures to free his boss from their painful grip. As this happened, the beast roared and opened its mouth wide to unleash a torrent of searing fire towards Shrike's remaining men. Most of the men darted out of the path of the inferno. However, one soldier was caught squarely in the full blast, his agonized screech piercing the air as his metal armor burned up rapidly, the searing heat effectively cooking him alive from the inside out. Shrike's focus snapped back to the immediate threat. He aimed his spear at the beast again, but just as he steadied his grip and prepared to fire, another thorny creature latched onto his arm. The unexpected tug wrenched his arm slightly off course, causing his shot to miss wildly. The lightning bolt streaked past the beast and struck a tree, splintering its trunk with a sharp crack. Shrike snarled and swung his arm, slamming the offending creature against a nearby tree with brute force. The impact was so fierce that it dented the tree trunk, the creature's body crumpling upon impact. It slumped to the ground, quickly dissolving into wisps of mana. He shot a quick glance at his remaining men, numbering just 5 now, including himself. 2 of them had smoke coming out of their spears, but the others looked like their shock spears were still capable of firing at least a few more shots. Shrike slammed the butt of his spear against the ground and pointed at the beast, which was preparing to charge at them, its massive foot kicking up dust. "When that thing comes close, throw everything we have at it." His men nodded and readied their rune pouches. And as the beast charged toward them, Shrike and his remaining men drew their firestorm runes and hurled them at the approaching monster. The runes detonated mid-air in a series of brilliant explosions. Through the chaos, Shrike narrowed his eyes as he spotted the glowing embers flickering off the beast's fur. "Finish it!" Shrike and his men unleashed their remaining bolts of lightning into the thick cloud of dust. The air was soon filled with the sound of pained growls as the bolts found their mark. For a brief, hopeful moment, everything fell quiet. Shrike allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the beast was finally dead. However, that fragile hope was shattered by the sounds of more screams. The beast had somehow survived, now grotesquely disfigured with half its body burnt away, exposing charred, skeletal limbs. Despite this, it still tore through Shrike's remaining men easily. Wesley in particular tried to run away, but he stumbled. The beast's clawed limbs lashed out, seizing him by the feet before its jaws clamped down and crunched his legs. Realizing the hopelessness of their situation, Shrike turned and ran. The continued screams of his men and the horrific sounds of carnage haunted his ears as they were torn apart and devoured by the monstrous creature they had once hoped to defeat. Breathing heavily, Shrike paused and braced himself against a tree, trembling as he pressed a hand into the rough bark. Gathering the courage to glance back, he saw the last of his men being brutally ended by the beast. "There's just no way." Shrike glared at the beast as it turned its blazing gaze toward him. He could only watch as the beast's flesh regenerated with horrifying speed. Muscle and sinew wove together seamlessly, grey skin then stretched over the newly formed muscles, and fiery fur sprouted, enveloping its monstrous form in a mantle of blazing menace. It was do or die now. Shrike's grip tightened around his spear and ran towards the beast as it too, charged towards him. Just as the beast's massive jaws were ready to clamp down on him, Shrike slid down and drove his spear upward with an upward thrust, piercing the beast's underbelly. The spearhead sank deep into the monster's flesh, tearing through sinew and muscle. The beast bellowed in agony and thrashed violently, dragging Shrike through the tangled underbrush and dirt as it attempted to dislodge the spear. Shrike clung to the spear shaft with all his strength, knuckles straining as he held on with everything he had left. But the beast's frenzied thrashing proved overwhelming. The spear snapped under the immense pressure. With a powerful kick from its hind legs, the beast hurled Shrike aside. His vision blurred as the beast's kick sent him crashing through a tree, the wood splintering around him before he slid face first into the dirt. Shrike's limbs trembled with the effort. But even with his vision still blurry, he managed to catch a fleeting glimpse of the beast roaring triumphantly. With that, Shrike resigned himself to his fate. He lifted his head just enough to watch the beast charge at him for what he believed was going to be the last time. Suddenly, just as the beast was charging at him, a large swarm of flies suddenly manifested from thin air, and completely covered the beast's head. The cloud of insects buzzed and darted, disorienting the creature. The beast roared in frustration, pausing to swat at the flies that tormented it. Shrike saw his chance and tried to push himself up and run away. However, as he attempted to move, he realized with a sinking feeling that he was unable to budge. His limbs were bound tightly by string, the thin cords digging painfully into his skin. He struggled against the restraints, but the strings held far too firmly, cutting into his flesh with each movement. His heart pounded as he watched the beast moving away, distracted by the persistent cloud of flies. It roared and snapped at the air, the swarm leading it further and further from Shrike's position. Relief washed over him momentarily, only to be replaced by a sharp sense of dread as he heard footsteps approaching from behind. Before he could react, a sharp pain exploded in his head as a foot came down hard and pressed his face into the dirt. Not too shabby, shame that this is where it ends. Chapter 20 No Fear. The ice sheets beneath Sera's feet were thinning fast as she sprinted through the swamp. The once solid paths of frozen water were melting into pools of murky slush, each step sending a splash of icy droplets into the air. When she risked a glance over her shoulder, Sera saw how the swarm of tall, lanky monstrosities were still closing in. She wasn't quite sure if it was because the monsters were fast or if she was somehow moving slower than expected. Fortunately, she caught sight of the portal back to the dungeon in her peripheral vision. She quickened her pace, but the sense of the monstrosities gaining on her still grew stronger with every step. Just a little bit more and I can be rid of those abominations. As Sera got closer to the portal, she stopped and spun around to face her pursuers, her feet digging into the ice sheet below. The thin layer of ice cracked beneath the weight of her left foot, plunging it into the swamp water with a splash. She yanked her foot out before bringing it down again. The moment her toe touched the icy water's surface, a burst of magic shot through and instantly froze a new, thicker sheet of ice that spread outwards. Channeling a larger portion of her magic, Sera commanded the decaying trees around her to stretch with loud creaks that filled the swamp. The trees slammed against the approaching monstrosities, wrapping their branches around the lanky creatures and dragging some into the water. The roots and branches coiled tightly, slowing their advance and giving Sera the precious seconds she needed. But one abomination managed to break through the barrier. Its grotesque form rushed toward her, and its twisted grin widened as it closed the distance. Sera sprinted toward the portal as fast as she could. She dashed through the opening, and once on the other side, commanded the floor that formed the portal to pull away, dismantling the structure piece by piece. All of the vines and branches which had formed the portal's arch retracted as they returned to their original states. Each vine twisted back into the earth while the branches melded seamlessly into the trunks of nearby trees. In seconds, the portal shrank rapidly as it diminished to a mere thread of light before finally vanishing. Yet, just as the portal dissipated and vanished, Sera nearly jumped as a gnarled limb from the abomination broke through. The severed limb flailed briefly before the portal closed completely, cutting it off from the rest of the swamp. It fell to the dungeon floor, twitching before becoming lifeless. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through her head, and she clutched her temples, wincing. It felt as though a memory was trying to break through, something important she was supposed to remember, but it slipped away like water through her fingers. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself and clear her mind, but the sensation left her uneasy. What was I doing here? Yet, before Sera could catch a break, a loud screech echoed through the dungeon, jolting her out of her thoughts. She spun around, her eyes widening as she saw a good chunk of the forest now engulfed in flames. The fire raged uncontrollably, sending plumes of smoke upwards. She ran as fast as she could towards the chaos, the trees and bushes seemingly parting ways as they cleared a path for her. The air grew hotter as she approached the heart of the inferno. Sera spotted Ermo, already transformed into his beast form and angrily swatting at a swarm of flies that never seemed to be able to truly disappear. His massive paws struck out with fury, but the swarm constantly replenished their numbers despite the many that burned to a crisp. The Elder Dryad pressed her hands against the ground and channeled her magic into the soil. An array of thick roots surged up from below and wrapped around Ermo's limbs, lifting him into the air with a violent jerk before slamming him back into the ground further away. While Ermo was dazed from the sudden assault, several large flower buds emerged from the ground around him. These blossomed rapidly into full bloom, then emanated a fine silver dust that clouded the air, quickly thickening into a shimmering haze. Gradually, while the cloud of dust thickened, Ermo's movements slowed until eventually he stopped moving altogether and fell into a deep sleep. Sera approached Zoha, who bowed slightly at her arrival. What happened? The demoness pointed at a man bound by layers of string against a tree. This human and his colleagues started a fight with Ermo. When I arrived, he had already transformed. Sera's eyes narrowed as she assessed the situation. Why did you allow the humans to infiltrate the dungeon in the first place? Zoha met Sera's gaze with a calm, albeit slightly weary expression. I was curious and wanted to see what they were capable of. She then bowed her head. I apologize if my actions have displeased you, mistress. Sera's expression softened just a fraction. I shall overlook your indiscretion for now. These particular humans posed little threat, however, should a genuine danger arise, you must be prepared to address it immediately. The demoness bowed her head again. Of course, mistress, I will keep your words in mind. Sera glanced around to take stock of the current situation. She was aware that Ermo wasn't capable of transforming at will. which only meant that he transformed involuntarily, either by being injured or a heightened emotional response, perhaps both. In either case, that was all the more reason for her to squeeze every last bit of information out of the human survivor. She looked at the human bound against the tree. He appeared resigned and exhausted, and his expression was one of stoic acceptance rather than fear, a response she planned on changing. Raising her hand, she summoned a tree beside her, its branches ending in sharp, needle-like points that hovered menacingly close to the human. I believe it's in your best interest to start talking. The man forced a smirk, trying to maintain a facade of defiance. You ain't getting shit from me. Sera turned to glance at Zoha. Can you break one of his legs? The demoness nodded. Which one, mistress? Did you manage to catch if the human prefers to use his right or left foot? I did, mistress, and he's almost certainly right-footed. Then crush that one first. The man's smile faltered. Wait, please, I'll talk. Zoha pulled out a slender needle from within her cloak and weaved it through the air, conjuring thin, shimmering strings from nothingness. She directed the needle toward the man's legs, the strings following her command and wrapping tightly around his already bound limbs. The demoness wrapped the enchanted threads tighter and tighter, the pressure building until the man's legs trembled under the strain. Then, she twisted the needle sharply, causing the strings to constrict as the man's right leg buckled with a sickening crunch. His screams echoed through the forest as the bones in his leg shattered under the relentless pressure. Zoha continued to tighten the strings, each turn of the needle bringing more excruciating pain, until the leg was nothing but a mangled mess of broken bone and torn muscle. The man's cries of anguish subsided into ragged sobs. Zoha finally released her hold, stepping back and allowing the man to slump to the ground. Was that sufficient, mistress? That was perfect, Zoha, I'll take it from here. Sera took a few steps back and raised her hands before clapping them together sharply. Roots rose and twisted from the soil. They wove together seamlessly, forming the legs and surface of a table. Sera's gaze turned to Zoha again. Put the human there. The demoness responded with a silent nod. She lifted him from the ground and slammed him onto the root table, his head hanging precariously over the edge. His groans echoed in the smoky air, a pitiful sound against the backdrop of flickering flames. More roots grew rapidly from the structure of the table, curling and twisting around the man's arms and legs. Stepping closer, Sera stood at the head of the table, her eyes cold and calculating. With a slight flick of her wrist, Sera summoned another root that snaked out from the base of the table, its surface rough with tiny, hair-like fibers, and coiled upwards with deliberate slowness. The root's tip pressed gently against the man's chin, tilting his head further downwards until his face was almost level with the table's surface. The man's eyes widened with terror as they darted upward. Just above him, the branches of the needle tree swayed menacingly, their sharp, glistening tips just barely hovering from his exposed skin. Sera leaned in closer, her voice low and icy. Last warning. Talk, or else. The man's eyes darted around frantically before locking onto Sera's, the sheer terror within them unmistakable. He attempted to nod, sending waves of pain coursing through his body. Saliva dribbled from the corners of his mouth, forming rivulets that dripped onto the forest floor. Seeing this, Sera snapped her fingers. The root table shuddered and morphed with a grinding noise before transforming seamlessly into a chair. The man was forced abruptly into a sitting position, his head slamming back against the backrest, eliciting a pained groan from him. Then, Sera closed her eyes and knelt on one knee. It's time for a small demonstration. Her right hand pressed firmly against the soil, while her left hand traced patterns through the air. The burning trees nearby responded one by one. Each fiery trunk shuddered briefly before collapsing inward. The inferno was swiftly subdued as thick, knotted roots surged upward from the ground, coiling around the flaming wood and their charred remains, smothering the flames and sealing away the last embers. Soon after, tiny saplings burst forth, their slender stems pushing through the blackened soil. These young trees grew with remarkable speed, their leaves unfurling in all manner of vibrant colors that stood in stark contrast to the ashen remains of their predecessors. Sera rose to her feet before shooting a cold glance upon the man, whose eyes were now wide with awe, his earlier fear momentarily replaced by sheer wonder. What you saw was just a small taste of my power. The man nodded fervently. Why yes, I understand, goddess. Please forgive me. For a split second, Sera almost broke her composure and chuckled. While it was natural for a mortal to still believe in the gods and goddesses of old, the Elder Dryad almost found it insulting to be compared to entities that have long been dead. Regardless, there is no harm in him believing that I am divine. First question, who sent you and your men here? The man took a deep breath, his expression turning into a slight frown as he weighed his words carefully. My men and I are part of the Black Eagles, a gang based in Marwood. Tell me more about Black Eagle operations and what they do exactly. We, usually smuggle and sell just about anything and everything. Beastkin slaves, magical items, dungeon cores. You name it, we have it. Makes sense, but what type of products are the most profitable? The big sellers are potions for both adventurers and even the military. While the Alchemists' Guild will charge people a fortune, we charge half or even a quarter of the price as long as nobody asks questions. A small grin tugged at Sera's lips as she heard the human speak. She just thought of an idea which could lead to the spirit tree's exponential growth. Regarding these potions, do the Black Eagles put in any additives to enhance their properties? We do. Once the cheap stuff turned people away, the big boss told us to mix in herbs like ether wisp and viper shade into stamina potions at first. And how did that go? Very good. If you neutralize the poisonous components, both ether wisp and viper shade are a great way to get high. Sera raised an eyebrow. Define high for me. The man tapped his remaining leg restlessly for a moment. Sure, basically, people get very happy and loose, you know what I mean. Ah, you mean to say they experience euphoria? Sort of. Viper shade makes you all happy and jumpy. Ether wisp makes you more mellow and relaxed. Either way, both made people come back for more and more of our potions. Sera began to pace around the chair, the forest floor softening the sound of her movement. As she completed her circuit, she leaned in close, her breath a whisper against his skin. Who is your leader and where can I find them? The man's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, a sheen of sweat breaking out on his forehead. His name is Vittorio, but everyone just calls him Vito. I don't know where he is right now. Seeing this, Sera's expression darkened. She gestured towards the needle tree, causing one of its sharp, slender needles to shoot out, piercing deeply into the man's remaining leg. The needle withdrew just as quickly, leaving behind a deep puncture wound. The man's scream tore through the forest. The skin around the wound changed almost immediately, the flesh hardening and darkening into rough bark. All while small green leaves sprouted from the newly formed wooden surface. Sera leaned back, crossing her arms over her chest. Start being honest, or else you'll be turning into a tree within 60 seconds. Panicked, the man's eyes widened in terror. I'm serious. Vito never tells anyone where he is. Sera scrutinized every nuance of the man's demeanor, the raw terror glistening in his eyes, the uncontrollable quivering of his limbs, and the sheer desperation in his voice. The man seemed sincere at the very least. If he had wanted to try and appease her, he likely would have tried to fake knowing Vittorio's location instead. Satisfied with his apparent honesty, Sera extended her hand over the man's rapidly transforming right leg. Her fingers hovered just inches above the bark-covered limb, the air around them shimmering with a faint, verdant glow. Under the influence of her magic, the rough bark receded gradually. The gnarled texture softened and dissolved, revealing patches of human flesh beneath, partially healed but still raw and tender. But she stopped the healing process midway, leaving his leg still half covered in bark. Give me more information, unless you prefer both of your legs to be dysfunctional. Gasping for breath, the pain evident in his voice, the man hurriedly divulged more. There's only one person Vito really trusts, his name's Vega. At this revelation, Zoha suddenly stepped forward. You mean Vega the poison? The man nodded. Yeah, him. Sera shot a glance at Zoha, curiosity flickering in her eyes. Have you met Vega before? The demoness reached into her cloak and took out a small vial of deep purple liquid. I've done business with the Black Eagles before and have spoken with Vega a few times. He's greedy, but shrewd. Not the worst person to negotiate with. Sera extended her hand, her fingers delicately curling around the vial as she took it from Zoha. And this is one of Vega's personally crafted poisons, mistress. This one is designed to only kill after 12 to 24 hours have passed. Excellent for if you need to kill someone quietly. Sera handed the vial back to Zoha, her mind already calculating the possibilities. Part of her considered removing Vega personally and inserting herself into the Black Eagle's command structure. But that move could prove to be too inefficient depending on how much loyalty Vega commanded. She then turned her gaze back towards the man. Where can we find Vega? The man gazed down for a moment. He likes to hang around the underground arena in Marwood slums. Zoha looked towards Sera. I've been there before, mistress. Despite the name, the place is actually much larger and can be more accurately described as an underground complex that happens to have an arena inside. Sera nodded, then glanced at the man again. Interesting, and you wouldn't happen to be able to lead me to Vega, can you? The man's face was drained of color. I can't, but it's not my fault. He also never tells his plans to anyone except his own direct entourage and Vito. Then you should come up with something to prove yourself useful to me, and fast. Panic seized the man as he trembled in his chair. Wait. I can actually lead you to Vega myself, I just... While the human continued his frantic plea, Sera narrowed her gaze, dissecting each of his movements with meticulous precision. She noticed the slight quiver in his voice, the way his gaze flickered away from her eyes as he spoke, and the nervous fidgeting of his fingers. The desperation in his tone sounded less about genuine fear of his leader and more about his immediate desire to avoid further pain. If he truly had the means to lead them to Vittorio, then there wasn't much reason for him to not say it earlier. Which meant that the human was either covering for his leader, or he was just saving his own skin. Either way, he's no longer useful. The moment the man finished speaking, Sera shook her head slowly, her hair catching the faint glimmer of light filtering through the canopy. How very disappointing. She turned away and she walked towards Ermo, her gaze briefly drifting to the demoness. Zoha, remove him. Yes, mistress. Moments later, the air was rent by the man's desperate screams. The piercing sound echoed among the trees, gradually fading as the distance between Sera and the source grew.